Okay, we are back online, Chuck.
Thank you. I apologize to the community for our technical issues. I'm not quite sure kind of how that worked for you from your visual, but we have done our roll call. We're moving on to our next item on the agenda. But before we do that, before we move to item 1.2, I wanted to welcome our new commissioner, Kathy Boyle, who is more than welcomed to the task at hand that we all have. And I was just hoping, Mrs. Boyle, if you could have a few moments or two to speak a little bit about your background and your reason why you're here.
Well, I'm here because I was appointed to fill the vacancy that became open on the committee. I previously served on City Council from 2012 through 2015. I'm currently serving on the Planning Commission for the City of East Lansing. I've lived in East Lansing since 1985. I currently live in the Ivanhoe neighborhood, and if people don't know where the heck that is, I didn't know about it either till I moved here. But I'm basically snuggled up against Trowbridge Road and the entrance onto 127. I'm a retired labor law attorney. Let me see, what else? Certainly have an interest in the city of East Lansing, our police force, and our community. So that's why I volunteered to serve on the committee to work on a commission.
Thank you so much for sharing, and we really appreciate you on behalf of the whole committee here. So we'll move on to item 1.2, approval of agenda of January 25th, 2021. Assuming that everyone's had a chance to look at that and there's no amendments or edits, I'll look for a motion to approve. Moved by Commissioner Josephson. Is there a second? Seconded by Vice Chair Root. Is there any discussion in regards to the agenda? 125-2021. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
I wonder if there would be room under old business to circle back around to the survey that's going to be done through the city of East Lansing to the community.
So we have the community input meeting discussion, which is kind of really what that is. Did you have something different from that as far as kind of what you wanted to talk about, or? Well,
I can talk about it at that point.
Okay, if that's okay with you, we'll go ahead and just include that in there with what you have going on. Is there any other more discussion in regards to the agenda 125-2021? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So moved. Thank you. And just for housekeeping purposes, when you do make a motion or make a vote, please go ahead and raise your hand and give me the verbal, please, so I can make sure I get everyone counted for, just to make sure that we're nice and clean for our minutes as well. All right, we'll move on to item 1.3, approval of the minutes, 1/11/2021. Did everyone get a chance to look at those? Are there any edits or amendments? I'll look for a motion for approval.
So moved.
Moved by Commissioner
Ellsworth
Etchison, thank you. And seconded by Vice Chair Root. Is there any discussion in regards to the minutes of 1/11/21? All those approved, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? So moved, thank you. All right, we'll move to item 1.4, written communication. It's a lot there, but not a lot for us to really actually go through. The first line item on there is just pretty much email correspondence from Vice Chair Root and Deputy Chief Gonzalez in relation to item 5.1, and just to let us know that we do have some of the questions, but not all the questions answered. And he is going to follow up with the second part of those answers in our next meeting, I believe, if I'm not mistaken on that. So that's what that first correspondence is regarding to. And then we have on the next second line, Vice Chair Root's memo, and I'm gonna go ahead and let Vice Chair Root really talk about the appendages and the things that are included in there, and just give you a quick run through. And then if you have any questions or follow up, you can definitely chime in. If you don't mind, Vice Chair.
Sure.
The memo explains 3 attachments that I put on the agenda, that the file names start App C, App F, and App I. Those are appendices to Section 2 draft of the report to council, which was appended to our agenda at our last meeting, January 11. So this is filling in more of the material that is referenced in that Section 2 about the recent situation of oversight of policing in East Lansing. And the idea with these appendices is to give people information and examples of the types of information and data that are currently available. So that's what 5 of these items are. The memo, the list of appendices, and then 3 of the actual appendices.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Does anyone have any comments, questions? All right, we'll move on. The next line item we have here is really a document that was submitted by Vice Chair Root, and it's really going to, I think, can be included in item 5.2 as far as our discussion, as far as some of those main things, unless someone wanted to chime in immediately about that right now. Please, Vice Chair Root, make sure I don't forget about this part of our discussion, including to what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in that item, a line item there, for me, please. All right, then we have another line item on there, integrating social work and policing from Commissioner Williams. Did anyone have any reaction questions? Did you want to have a statement or two in regards to the information, Commissioner Williams?
I believe that's part of our Section 3. Is that right?
Well, yeah, some of the information there's going to be included in our talk in Section 3. So, you know, I just wanted to make sure if you wanted to comment on that or say anything about anything that you submitted to us until we get to that part.
Some of it was sparked, especially the material from Harris County was sparked by the discussion that we had with community mental health people at the last session. They were very taken with some of the programs in Harris County, so I looked those up. And there are a variety of ways that social workers are integrated into police work or combined with police work. And that document tries to go through some of those different ways or models.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. And we definitely will be talking about that going forward. And appreciate you submitting that information for us to be able to have to look through. It was very helpful in regards to our last presentation that we had with the social workers. So thank you for doing that. Any other comments before we move on? All right, then the last item on there is just our recommendation discussion for Section 3, and just really, you know, giving a little bit of structure on what we'd like to have as far as the outcome, and specifically what we will be talking about, and hopefully we can get to maybe a point of consensus about kind of really what to build around going forward in that section. So that's just really an outline for you to have there. So hope everyone's had a chance to look at that document. And if everyone has done that, we can go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda. All right, so we'll move to item 1.5. Justin, just real quick, do we have anyone on the line tonight?
There's currently one caller in the queue.
Okay. So pursuant to MCL 15263 subsection 1, limiting public comment to 5 minutes per individual, does anyone want to entertain that tonight? As far as enforcing a 5-minute rule for public comment? Yes, Vice Chair, is that a move? Are you making a motion, Vice Chair Root?
I would move that we limit public comment to 5 minutes per individual for today's meeting. We've been doing that at each of our meetings, and I think it's helpful to be consistent.
Thank you. And I think that's already been seconded by Commissioner Josephson.
Yeah, second that.
Thank you. Is there any more discussion in regards to item 1.5, limiting public comment to 5 minutes? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? So moved. We'll be limiting public comment to 5 minutes, and so we'll move to communication from the audience. item point 2. Jesse, whenever you're ready, please.
Okay, the caller is phone number ending in 053. You may unmute and address the committee. Again, phone number ending in 053. You may unmute and address the committee.
Give that person a few seconds or more to see if we can get them figured out here with their mute button.
Is it sometimes *6 that works,
Yeah.
Justin?
Yes, it's *6 to unmute. Again, phone number 053.
We have so few people calling in and giving us input. I hate to not take advantage of someone who's actually there. So I'm just trying to be patient, see if we get lucky and we can get them in on the line. We'll move on here for, after a couple seconds or so, but I just really want to get whoever's calling a voice. What is the prompt again, Justin? Star what?
*6 to unmute. Again, that's phone number ending in 053.
Right, looks like it's going to be, unfortunately, we can't get this person in. We must move on here. I'm just going to give another 10 seconds or so, and then we will move on to the next item on item 3.1 here. *6 if you're on the line. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. If you can hear us and you really want to have a chance to speak or have something to say, please email us, email the committee and what you were going to say tonight. So we can definitely appreciate what you have to offer from the community input that you wanted to have this evening. And we definitely will make sure that we address it in our next meeting. If it's something urgent, we'll address that beforehand and get back to you. So thank you for your participation. We'll go ahead and move on to item 3.1, presentations from Prosecuting Attorney Carol Siemon and Chief Assistant Prosecutor Mike Cheltenham. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Carol Siemon, and Mike Cheltenham is the Chief Assistant Prosecutor. And I see this a little more as a conversation, maybe a first conversation, because I think all of us have been thinking about the issue of how to deal with this for over a year now, but especially in the last year with events that have occurred. So historically, how we've responded to allegations of police violence, there hasn't been a real clear cut process for it. And so what I've tried to in the last year is determine how we are going to respond in Ingham County. And I've also consulted with some of the other prosecutors from across the state of Michigan to get a sense for what they're doing. And as you know, having looked at best practice issues for police accountability from across the nation, this is a conversation that's occurring almost everywhere. So I was an assistant prosecutor in the 80s and 90s, dealt with resisting and obstructing in other cases then. Over the years, I've given some thought to how that has impacted on community members and disproportionately impacted some more than others, particularly those who are young and those who are Black or brown. And so when I came back to the prosecutor's office as the elected 4 years ago, that was kind of back on my radar. And I've been watching the resisting and obstructing cases and other cases. We've had a few that have come to us specifically to review officer-involved shootings or use of force. Those have been relatively rare. thankfully. I think maybe 4 since I've been in office, and one was for another county. So we didn't have a magic answer for how we would look at police use of force issues, but certainly there were the couple of East Lansing cases that put that on my radar screen more specifically. And that's when the use of, when our resisting and obstructing policy was formulated, that said, we're going to look at our videos, we're going to review all evidence, and we're going to look at specific criteria to determine whether or not we should issue charges before we issue them, because both the cases locally as well as the cases across the United States, and a couple in Wayne County and Oakland County that were really fairly dramatic, they really highlighted that you need to have all the information, because those are very charged, can be very charged kinds of arrests that start with a relatively minor event and then escalate into a much more significant event. So that policy was something that we developed, was a work in progress and released in August. Meanwhile, of course, the George Floyd murder occurred and a number of other events. So we also were looking at internally, how do we respond for other kinds of police violence? And at that time, we created a hierarchy that said if it's a death in custody, and I will say I did not know at that time about the death in custody at the Lansing Police Department, but if it's a death in custody, I had talked to Dana Nessel, and she said the AG's office would agree to handle those. So they would go to Michigan State Police for investigation, and those would go directly to Michigan State Police, not come to our office. Then we would look at how we would handle other situations where there may be allegations that the police officer used improper force. And what we wanted to sort out was, what's our purpose in reviewing those? And we really are looking at those as to whether a case rises to the level that we might consider charging the police officer. This isn't like a personnel or administrative review like you guys do, or an internal affairs kind of investigation, or something that would be for a civil lawsuit. This is strictly looking at the issue of a review for a potential warrant against the police officer. And in those instances, we will accept those cases for filing after the Michigan, because typically Michigan State Police would investigate, accept those cases for filing. We do decide whether we should do the warrant review in-house or whether we should refer it through the special prosecutor process, which also goes to the AG, but only insofar as they decide whether or not a special prosecutor is warranted. And if so, then another county prosecutor would do the review in those cases. And so to make a decision whether a case is one we'll handle internally or refer it for a special prosecutor, we are going to look at a variety of factors, such as the media notoriety. Is there a perception or a reality that we can't be fair or unbiased in our evaluation, either towards the community or towards the police? But if it's a kind of a run-of-the-mill situation, or it involves an off-duty kind of allegation, then we would probably review that in-house. And so we are trying to create a situation where we are reviewing our own community and holding ourselves and the community accountable. On the other hand, trying to create a structure that doesn't lead to a potential for bias or conflict of interest. So we are going to continue to evaluate this as we see what you are doing, and also as we see what best practices are. Our best practice is to have an independent statewide body both investigate and do the warrant reviews for these cases, or is there some other process? So that's kind of where we are right now, and Mike might want to chime in with a few things I left out, or we can open it for questions.
Carol, I'd only emphasize one thing that you mentioned, just because the amount of work and thought that you put into it, I think, needs to be elucidated a little bit was the conversation you just had about the cases that we've decided to keep or that you've decided to keep. And I must tell the group that it's a struggle. I'm sure you're aware that in other parts of the state, other prosecutors' offices have made a blanket decision to, whenever there's an allegation of improper use of force and a charge is sought from the prosecutor's office, the local prosecutor immediately recuses themselves and does not take part in that decision-making process. And one of the things that Carol was very much aware of is that when there appears to be a conflict of interest, and we ignore that and we move forward with cases that come here in Ingham County and that involve our own police officers. If we simply just ignore the fact that there looks to be a conflict of interest and don't deal with that and don't deal with the case because it's local, then there's sort of the understanding that we are not being accountable to the community we serve. And so Carol wanted to make sure that the distinction was clear, at least for our APAs, that when a case comes in and it's a case not involving a shooting, because as she mentioned, or a fatality, those automatically go to the AG's office. She's made the decision that in order for the community to see what we're doing and to for us to be accountable to them, that we are going to hold on to those cases and we're going to look at them closely and not automatically recuse ourselves from those, because and she can explain this further, but it's my belief from my conversations with her that essentially Carol wants to occupy that space where we do have an opportunity to sort of say to law enforcement, because we work so closely with them, that this is conduct that we find unacceptable, or this is conduct that is acceptable, or this is conduct that we have issues with, and we'd like to talk about ways in which that conduct or that training can be changed in the future or modified. So I just wanted to emphasize that portion.
And I think, thank you, Mike. And it is, as he mentioned, it's a different view of how we hold ourselves accountable. And he alluded to Ellie Savitt, who's the new Washington County prosecutor, who just, when he took office, said all cases involving police use of force are going to be referred out. I'm a member of a network of prosecutors across the nation called Fair and Just Prosecution. They recommend keeping them in-house. Most of the prosecutors in Michigan will keep them in-house for some use of force and will refer others out. So there is absolutely zero best practice right now. And I think as I'm listening to tonight to how what you talk about, and then as you formulate your local practice, if we have a community conversation that includes the community advocates, the police, many of us are members of the LPAC organization, we continue to have these discussions. It can evolve, because I do think it's an evolving practice. Really, what is the best way for us to hold each other accountable and to have our own community standards, which may be different than in some other places, and make sure that that people have this clear cut of idea of what's going to happen as is possible. So that's where we are. And I wish I had something very clear and specific to say, magic, this is exactly what we're going to do. But I think the presumption is that some kinds of cases just really absolutely have to go out, but that we're open to what this commission decides and what you are finding in your processes about those intermediate cases that don't involve death, but all involve allegations of violence.
Thank you. And I'll open it up to any commissioners who have any reactions, questions, or follow-ups to some of the things you've heard tonight already. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
Hello, thank you for being here tonight. You had talked about the process, and we've learned that also as part of this work, that if things go to the Michigan State Police, and then it goes on from there, whether it's your office or the AG's office. And so one, I have a concern about the policing themselves when it comes to investigating. And two, I guess I want to hear, because you talked about biases. And so I want to, because we all have them. And so I'm interested to hear how your office can objectively look at a case and removing biases, because as you know, around the country, we see time and time again where there's extreme use of force, where there was something very simple that escalated very quickly. In fact, the police escalated it as opposed to de-escalating. And someone is either hurt or killed. As a result of that, we'll see an officer be arrested, but then that's it. That's as far as it goes. And so I'm really concerned about or interested to hear how your case or your office will look at these cases in an objective manner, how you are removing biases when you're looking at these cases, because I do have concerns of how things look historically have played out with the prosecutor's offices as it relates to favoring the police officers.
Okay. So thank you for that question. So that's a complicated one, and I'm going to answer it in parts. So first of all, when we talk about policing actions, I want to be clear that what our office does, we touch the police in many places, or they touch their actions, but that what we are going to be reviewing and should be reviewing is there a legal reason to charge this police officer with a crime? And that is a separate decision. And I think it's very frustrating for many people, many citizens to look at police action that they say, but this is really bad stuff. We don't like what's going on here. And then the prosecutor is looking at it through the lens of, can I prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime here? So I think we have that's something that the police commission and we all have to discuss, is what are those intermediate steps where you're holding someone accountable, but it isn't, I can't issue a charge against somebody unless I believe I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt that someone committed a crime. So the bias issue is multifaceted. First of all, when I was referring to it, I was specifically referring to just the general bias about, people perceive that the prosecutor, because we work so closely with the police, that we might, automatically favor the police. And one of the struggles is that we all know that the institutions themselves are racist. There are no major institutions in the United States that are not. Policing is, prosecution is, courts are, probation. They are, because that's how they were created. Good people are involved in working on changing those issues, but we're all having to work within the structures that evolved over time that were inherently racist. So what we've been doing in my office since I took office is we started with implicit bias training right away in 2017. I worked for 2 years to get the very Institute of Justice to come and work with us for data collection and data analysis, and they are taking a deep dive, or will be taking a deep dive into what kinds of information about demographics, kinds of crimes, kinds of sentencing, who do we refer to diversion or specialty courts, how do we treat people differently based on age, race, different demographics, including the victim demographics. So I think the first step is you have to be conscious. And that's one reason we want to keep our cases here in Ingham County as much as we can, because it's our community and we set the standard for what we want in regards to training, what we want involves our community as a whole community, East Lansing and Ingham County. And that might be different than another county. I'm not disparaging another county, but they may have different dynamics. So the work we're doing here should stay here as much as it can. When there's not a concern that because of media attention or a direct conflict, like we just finished a big jury trial with someone who is now accused or alleged to have committed violence, where we really have to send that case out, that we want to keep it here because we're part of that community and that discussion. So it's real. I mean, the idea of bias, Eric and I have actually had several conversations because we're sort of neighbors. We live just kind of around the corner from each other. We've had a few conversations about what does it look like for both policing and for reviews? Do we do it locally? Do we do it at the state level? What would happen if a police officer is fired from one community and moves into another community? What do we do if the prosecutor does or does not keep a Brady list and doesn't notify the defense? If we have reasons to believe we have problems with a certain police officer, and how do we also avoid painting everyone with the same brush when it comes to policing, because I'm not someone who believes in abolishing police or that police are bad. I mean, we need police. So how do we improve the structures? We bring in the right people, get the wrong people out, and then create those reviews. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but it is very complicated and multifaceted. But I think one of the best answers is the best way to eliminate biases, first of all, to be aware that we have it. So we've all done the Harvard implicit bias tests. So we've all done an institutional analysis. We've had several workshops. We're continuing to do that so that we're at least alerted to it. Vera is going to tell us. We already know that in some of our arrests that we're like the rest of the state, we're terribly disproportionate. We've reduced our incarcerations to prison by 27%, but our percentages of African American compared to white continue to be the same. That's about 40%. Go to the Michigan Department of Corrections. So sometimes even when I'm trying to deal with mass incarceration, but the racial disproportionality persists. With felony firearms statewide, there's just been a recent report from Safe and Just Michigan that said we're one of the worst offenders. We're also one of the larger counties, so that's part of the reason. But about 90% of our people who are there solely for a felony, in prison for solely for a felony firearm conviction, are Black. That's very consistent with the rest of the state. That's a problem. So sometimes we're looking at very specific targeted kinds of charges or kinds of situations where people are having encounters with the police. So like Lansing Police Department initiated, I don't know how it's playing out, but a new policy about traffic stops. Not stopping for things like cracked windshields, license plate lights out, those really minor offenses that for some people really escalate into deadly encounters. I don't know what East Lansing's talking about. Certainly when we look at Gazito and Loggins, those were two very minor contexts that escalated beyond what was justified, in my opinion. I mean, morally justified, maybe legally justified. I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in that answer, I must say. If I may, I may be a little bit loose with my question here, but I'm just struggling because when it comes to officer-related incidences that reach to your table, it just doesn't seem that those people are held in the same regard as, for example, a minority person in regards to being prosecuted and subsequently being charged with something that's life-changing. And we're always talking about how some of these nonviolent contact end up being violent, and it just really seems like it's very destructive in so many different ways. And I struggle with the disparity of how few times officers are charged or held accountable to some of their actions. Why is it that they have somewhat a more degree of room to be able to do these behaviors, especially when you have someone, you brought up the Brady list, especially when you have people who are on this list who have had several complaints, who have been kind of involved in a way that, really would bring a lot of suspicion, and how those people time and time again seem to not be held accountable. I'm not quite sure how you can answer that question, but it's just very obvious from the community standpoint that there's a difference in how you go about holding accountability.
Okay, so let's give an analogy. So sometimes, so let's say someone goes to a doctor and has surgery, and that person has a bad outcome, like they're worse off than they were, maybe dead. And so now you have a whole variety of different scrutinies. You're going to look at that particular situation. So you may have the hospital who's going to say, where they're going to do some kind of review. They always will do a review. And they'll say, were policies followed? Did this doctor do what that he or she was supposed to do given the hospital standards and protocols? might be a licensing review of some sort. I'm not an expert in this, and someone like Kathy Boyle, who's like more of a labor expert, might not be able to answer this. But there are varying levels of reviews. There may be a civil lawsuit from the family saying, "Hey, this person, this doctor was negligent, and we're going to bring a tort action. We're going to ask for money damages." And then there could be, like, this activity was so egregious. This doctor was under the influence of drugs or drunk when he or she did the surgery, and this person died. There might even be, so it could rise to the level of a criminal case. Now, let's take the criminal case. If I get the case and saying a doctor did something in the course of his or her job responsibilities that led to a bad outcome, we have to apply the standards of what that person's job was. So it's different if you had someone who walked into someone's hospital room and smothered them with a pillow. That's, kind of clear-cut homicide. But if you have a doctor who's trained to perform surgery and then there's a bad outcome, that doesn't mean the doctor was neglectful or that the doctor was criminally liable. But it could. And that's what we have to look at. So I guess that's the most, Chuck, the way that I would analogize it to police. So if you have two people walking down the street and they engage in a fight and then one pulls a knife on the other person and stabs them, that's going to be it's a different situation than, say, a police get called to an altercation or make a contact because there's reason to believe, reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred. Then that officer has to apply his or her training and the job responsibilities that that person has. So again, if the officer is alleged to have engaged in unreasonable force, to have done something that's not appropriate, there may be the supervisor, there may be personnel something that happens. There may be someone's fired. There may be someone who gets their certification as a police officer pulled. There may be a civil lawsuit brought against that police officer seeking money damages, saying that, I can't walk because, you hurt me and my legs, damaged. And there also may be a request to the prosecutor's office to evaluate to see if the facts not just were maybe bad or something we don't want to have happen, but did they rise to the level that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime occurred? So just like with the doctor, you can have sometimes situations that it's like, wow, maybe a different doctor would have done something different and that wouldn't have happened. Maybe they're neglectful. Maybe they get their license pulled because they've been drinking on the job. That doesn't necessarily, it could be enough to charge that doctor criminally. And similarly, it could be enough to charge the police officer criminally. But to charge a police officer criminally, we have to apply the same standard of proof that we do for anything. And that's not just, was there a bad outcome, but can we meet the elements of the crime? Did this individual, in the course of this context, commit a crime that I can prove the elements beyond a reasonable doubt? And Mike may be able to follow up on that a little bit more. And I don't know. Oops.
You're muted, sir.
Mr. Grisby, one of the things I think you sort of pointed out, and I think Carol was alluding to, is the idea that, there is that disparity that you see. There's the destructive things that are going on when Black, brown young men are usually arrested. And then you've got the officers being accused of something, acting, in a manner that could be criminal, but no charges ever come out of that. And I think one of the things that I've noticed that you find when you're doing these, when our office receives these kind of reports, is that there's a disparity in the level of investigation that you get. And I don't know, I can't really speak to why that is. I mean, I think part of it's just, it makes sense because officers are part of unions. Officers, if they aren't following the rules and they're certified, then there's going to be investigations by other officers within that department. And then if there's the chance that the officer has done something that is going to result in criminal charges, it's usually investigated by MSP or some sort of outside agency. And, there's 3 or 4 levels right there that you have of that sort of review. And so when when our office gets a use of force warrant request, you're going to find that it's a pretty big warrant packet. It's got several hundred pages worth of reports in there. And when you're talking about a regular case on the street where an officer tries to make an arrest, a lawful arrest as it may be, and there's an R&O that arises out of that, you're talking about something that's much smaller. You're talking maybe, half a dozen to maybe, 10 pages worth of reports if you're lucky. And so there's a level of investigation that ends up being 2 different types of investigations essentially. And when our office has that much more information, one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, what would happen if this level of investigation was applied to all those other cases where you're talking about just simple encounters with the police and people on the street that do end up being R&Os? What if we had that level of investigation where we've got all this information? I can tell you right now, in looking at some of these use of force cases, we've got video from all over, where in an R&O case you might have a couple different body cams and maybe some NVR. It's just a vast difference in the amount of information. I think that somehow leads to prosecutors coming to the conclusion with all this evidence that they usually don't get, that it's not possible in this particular case to charge this person with the same standard that would use regardless of how much information we have. Can we prove this beyond a reasonable doubt? And I just want to note that because it's something that you see it and it's sort of counterintuitive, but it is, I think, one of the things that has to be addressed because it's a disparity that I think leads to some of that, what you're seeing where police officers seem to be getting away with things when really we've got, a lot more information about whether or not we can charge them than we do in a regular case.
Thank you. Before Commissioner Harrell goes and then Commissioner Williams, I saw raise his hand. I just want to make a comment, and it just seems, and it, please understand I'm coming from a community perspective, but it just really seems that it's very, very clear with some of the evidence that you get, the visuals from the body cam, the previous behavior in some of the different cases that have really brought to national attention. It just really seems obvious that convictions can happen more often when it comes to some of these different use of forces. And I know there's a lot of good cops out there doing a great job, but there are some bad ones that are out there that are really emboldened by this process that does not seem to be getting better for a lot of people around the country. Commissioner Rowe, then Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
So maybe to tighten this up or to bring this full circle, I'm not sure so sorry, as a way of introduction, Dr. Cedric Rowe. I am a professor of criminal justice. My specialty is police use of force. I'm not sure that the medical analogy really works for me in the sense that there are 2 additional hurdles, right? The first is when we're talking about how these encounters begin. From that standpoint of reasonable suspicion, we know that is an incredibly low threshold, right? Maybe this is sort of outside the scope here, but in looking in the materials in the agenda today, we have an instance where a complaint was filed against an officer where the officer supposedly admitted that they did not have even the bare minimum reasonable suspicion to stop somebody, right? So given that relatively low bar to initiate the encounter and then buttressed up against qualified immunity, right, then I'm not sure that we're talking about a situation that is really comparable to any other type of occupation in terms of getting a charge to stick, right? And so from that standpoint, I think one of the important things that we're talking about is how to hold officers accountable in a variety of other ways, given that there is a relatively high bar to clear for charging an officer in these types of situations, right? And so one of the things that I had thought we were going to be talking about when the R&O materials that we received today is essentially a description of, what happens when our office is being asked to issue a warrant so that somebody can be charged with resisting and obstructing, right? My first question is, what does your office do when an officer comes and that's the only charge, right? We've talked about this at the national level. We've talked about this in these meetings before, right? There's generally a perception that a resisting and obstructing charge is used by officers in some situations to cover up for uses of force, right? That I mishandled the situation, went wrong, and now, oh crap, I need to charge this individual with something to make sure it doesn't look too bad on my end, right? So what does your office do when there's a request for a warrant for an R&O? Right? To me, the first question is, well, what is the initial charge that they were being arrested for? If an R&O is the only request, why are you not asking for charges for whatever the initial stop was for, right?
So thank you, Dr. Hurrell. I think that's a great question. And I think that's part of the conversation, part of the what I've been looking at for a number of years. And that is how do we have, when you're driving down the street, say, and you're a Black or brown person, and we know that it's much more likely pretty much anywhere in the United States that you're going to be pulled over, or if you're riding your bike, or if you're walking down the street. We know that some of those encounters are deadly. Now, sometimes someone is, a contact is made because they have just left the scene of an armed robbery, or they've kidnapped a child, and there's a really big reason why you want to initiate that stop. Sometimes, and we know there are pretext stops, and pretext stops can be based on things like dangling rear view ornaments or loud exhausts, or things that if I'm driving down the street, I might or not. I don't want to get stopped for that if I'm doing it now. But if I'm going to get pulled over, it's not going to be because of the color of my skin. So we know that's true, and so the resisting and obstructing was one particular place that I've been looking at for a while anyway. And then, frankly, the Loggins case came along, and I didn't initially realize it was our case until East Lansing information published an article, and all of a sudden it dawned on me that Gazito was a city attorney case, and that this Loggins was ours. Now, what happens a lot of times is minor stops actually wouldn't come to us anyway. So if you have a minor, it's some of the most problematic kinds of stops are for things that would go to the city attorney's office, right? Loud and boisterous conduct or things like that. So I do favor, and that's something the police department has to decide, is what are valid stops for you. What I've told the police, and not all have liked it, was that if I see a situation where I think that the reaction is disproportionate, so if you pull someone over for a cracked windshield and then they don't show their ID or something, I don't want that escalated. I don't want them pulled out of the car. I don't want them beaten up. I don't want to see a minor situation that is not dangerous to the public or to individuals become something where someone is hurt. So those are very difficult. And you raised a very good point. That's it. Police, we can apply our scrutiny to say, we're going to look at the circumstances of an original contact. If someone's walking down the street, was this a stop and frisk? Did they have reasonable suspicion that a crime occurred? Was there a call that had just been a home invasion a block away, and someone with lime green pants was seen running from the house, and now you're seeing someone with lime green pants? Or is this some kind of situation where an officer is driving down the street and sees somebody whose color of the skin is Black, or they look like they're a teenager, or it's a group of young individuals on bikes, and you think maybe they did something wrong? I agree with you. I don't want those. I don't want those cases. And if they come to us and we are able to ascertain, I think what Mike was alluding to was a lot of times we get a report and it's less than a page. And it may be, effectuated a traffic stop, exited the motor vehicle, activated my overheads, exited my motor vehicle, made contact with a person, asked for driver's license registration, then somehow the person ends up on the ground. And we don't really that's really, about all we get. So we're saying, no, we're going to send those back for further investigation. We're going to attempt refuse them. We're going to get if their body cams. We want to know more about this. And the presumption is, you got to tell us why there was a reason, what the initial context for the stop was. And and then if there's not something that justifies us issuing a 2-year or a 4-year felony, then we're not. But that's only a start. I mean, I agree with you. It's only a start.
Thank you. Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
On the subject of investigation, now, I understand that the police department does investigations. And it looks like your office also does investigations. You do not do investigations. Earlier, you were talking about investigating police officers prior to possibly charging them with crimes. Is that not an investigation?
I might have misspoken. So some prosecutors' offices, especially very large ones, do have investigators on staff. We don't. The police are our investigators. So it's, the police agency makes a determination that they're sending something to be reviewed by Michigan State Police, or, could be another department. I don't know what the agreements are. But other than that, frankly, we have situations, and it's historically used to be very frustrating me with domestic violence cases, where I'd feel that, and this is in the 80s and 90s, that I didn't have enough information to make a decision, and I would send it back for further investigation. If we don't get more information back from the law enforcement agency, then we can't go out and get that ourselves. So we don't have it. We don't initiate complaints. We don't do our own investigations. And so that is a struggle, because we do have to rely on that's why we only can review what we actually have. We don't go out and get anything else generally.
That problem strikes me as very similar to what this Police Oversight Commission is going to have, because they don't know from investigations either. I mean, they're just a bunch of, retired gentlemen who meet in the evening to review something. And so all their investigatory power is deferred to the police department. And that makes it very hard to investigate a police officer. And I have several questions, and I don't think I have the time allotted to answer them, but what's the prospect? You mentioned earlier that there was talk about having a state agency do investigations of police officers.
Well,
is
after
that in the works?
I have no idea. I'm one prosecutor, and so I try to keep my head, this is of great interest to me, because I want a more fair and equitable system for everybody. So I've kind of watched it, but really, frankly, I haven't seen much of anything since in June, after May 25th, there certainly was a lot of, and there was, what the AG said and what the governor said. And, there were, maybe going to be potential legislation. And I honestly don't know what's happened since. I mean, you and I have talked, and I've talked with many other people. I think that certainly when we're talking about overall fairness, for trusting that police officers are viewed consistently, and we're not talking about individual criminal prosecution, but getting bad people out, and also not having people move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. If we're going to build the trust in the community for the police, which we want, and that is that people can rely on there being good officers who are protecting them, as opposed to being fearful. That's what we want, right? We all want that. Then how we get there, it is really a struggle, and I, like I said, with someone with Kathy Boyle's background, or some of you the others, I don't have that background. I've never been involved with internal affairs or investigations, and police unions are very unusual. They're not the standard.
Here's a question. You for a hypothetical question, you're investigating, you have on your plate a police officer who may have done something wrong, and this is the file comes to you. How do you know when the police department, that internal affairs or whoever it is, has done an adequate investigation? And if you think that they haven't done an adequate investigation, what do you do to make them do more?
Well, that's a really good question, Eric. And first of all, we don't work with internal affairs directly, and we don't get their reports afterwards. Years ago, I did prosecute a police officer for off-duty sexual assault, and I worked with internal affairs to a certain extent, but they didn't share information with me about like the statement of the officer or anything. Because those of you who do labor law know that there are very specific rules about that, and I don't get that information. So that's a really good question. We don't do our own investigation. We have to rely on the information that we get from the sources. And so while I have a high degree of regard for our police agencies in the Ingham County area, it is inherently a conflictual situation. I think it's a challenge, and that's why I think this is only the beginning of conversations. I don't have an answer for how I should be doing it based on what is happening here in Ingham County. Because I think,
in your experience, have you just developed any techniques or tricks that you would like to pass on to a poor little city about how to get more information from the police department about their investigation?
well, so I'm going to ask Mike to pipe in here because I was an assistant prosecutor from 1983 to 1995. I left, came back in 2017. He came in around 1999 and has been there ever since. So we didn't overlap, but between the two of us, we cover most of like almost 40 years. And there are, I think, inherent struggles. I had problems, and I think we still do, with if we don't feel we have enough, we ask for more. And if we don't get more, sometimes it's because it doesn't exist. Sometimes we don't have the, information. Oh, Kathy raised her hand. So, Mike, what do we do when we don't get information back?
Oh, just quickly, there's not much more you can do other than to keep asking and document the fact that you're asking, and then have them write back reports that indicate we've looked, we don't have these things. It is really something where, as the APA or the prosecutor is looking at the file and trying to make decisions and reading between the lines to see if you feel comfortable with what you have. And if there's a suspicion that you might have more, the only really thing you can do is ask for it and document that you've asked for it, and keep doing that as often as you can. And there isn't any particular trick or magic to it. Law enforcement is generally very good about giving us what they have and looking and following up based on our requests for information. They've asked for, I can tell you many times they've gone and looked for stuff that, at first doesn't seem like it's irrelevant, but if you keep asking and if you can explain why you need it, they'll go get it for you, and hopefully you can get that information. But you just got to document the fact that you're requesting.
And I will just say one thing real quick, and I know that other people have questions, that I don't think, well, I may be wrong, but I have not seen that locally we have people, that's too strong. As a general rule, if we ask for information, I don't feel like we have police departments that are purposely hiding stuff from us. But does it mean that the whole story comes out? No. Is there I don't know what the national discussion is about what do you do if you want to have investigations in targeted issues or targeted situations that can get beyond what a local agency is willing to do. And I'm saying that with no denigration towards those agencies. I'm just saying that's a real issue. It's a real issue. And I don't know what the answers are.
Thank you. Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton, and then Commissioner Boyle, I think I saw who wanted to ask you some follow-ups.
Yes, I did want to follow up on the the implicit bias training that you talked about, and wondered if you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer at the prosecutor's office. And then the other thing is more of a comment, as I was hearing you talk about, sometimes getting upwards of 200 pages of information that you don't have necessarily on something else, but on the officers because of the cameras and all of this information that comes forward, and that you take a great deal of, pause and concern and want to make sure you go through all of this and, dot your I's and cross your T's before issuing a charge or charges. And my comment was like, wow, I sure wish that there was that same abundance of caution given to our Black citizens, our brown citizens, or that same level of pause by the police. That, and I know that's not something that you can answer, but that's just a comment, because when I heard that, I was thinking, man, there's a lot of extra abundance of caution given for the officer, but that same degree is not necessarily given to our citizens.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Atchison. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, it does say the county has an equity. We have our in-house efforts that we're doing. We don't have our own person with that targeted specific responsibility. I guess that would probably be Mike or Kathy in our office. We have a work group that's working directly with Vera, which is 8 individuals in our office who have volunteered to have an ongoing effort to both for education and also reviewing policies and looking at those issues. It's something that within the constraints of our staffing that we certainly, there's no one I think who works there who wouldn't tell you that that's something we think about and look at, but are we as developed as we could be? No, because we're chronically understaffed too. We're trying to do 100 different tasks, but it's one that we focused on since I've come into the office.
Commissioner Boyle, please go ahead.
Thank you. Kathy Boyle here. I just wondered 2 things. One is basically a comment, and that is that the standard of conviction for a crime is obviously guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the standard for firing a public employee is clear and convincing evidence, which is considerably less than guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But more than the standard of evidence for a civil jury verdict of damages, which would be preponderance of the evidence. So I know that certainly enters into your ability to prosecute for the complaints that come to you. But my question is, if a complaint comes in with a warrant request against a police officer, is the investigation done by that officer's own department, or is it generally done by another police department?
I think all the ones that I've done since I've been here have been by Michigan State Police. I looked at one back, I think in the 80s, that the Sheriff's Department did it for LPD or something. Where a smaller department might have the sheriff do it, but we don't, I don't think I think they've all gone to Michigan State Police.
To my knowledge, yes, that's true.
But yes, they shouldn't, if we're looking at ones where we might potentially be looking at charging a police officer, those should not be investigated by that local office, the police agency.
Thank you. And we really appreciate your time and really respond to some of these questions. Some of them are very, very tough for very tough issues out here. You talked about perception. You talked about institutions being racist, and that's really what they're based off of in some ways. And we all know really the basis of how policing started here in America. I guess my comment is why don't you work with the Internal Affairs Office of the Police Department? Why don't you interact with some individual?
They won't. Because it's a labor management issue. I can't.
Now, so, and I apologize if this question is very ignorant. So is that a conversation that you would have when you talk about the police union contract? in changing that dynamic, or is that something totally off the wall?
Can I just answer that question quickly? So really,
Please.
it's a matter that the employer has an employee-employer relationship, and they have a right to ask what their public employees have been doing with their time. What have they done? And you can't really ask those questions in a criminal situation the same way. So the employer has an authority and a control over their employees that would make someone give up their rights under the Constitution. So it kind of like puts you in a position of power and employment that makes you build these walls and say, this is personnel and this is criminal, and they can't switch back and forth. So it's this Garrity rights in the sanitation workers case, that all of this came up when an employer cannot compel someone to speak and then use that information in a criminal realm, because it basically gives up someone their rights. It makes someone compelled to give up their rights of self-incrimination. Because I, as the personnel director or city manager, can say, employee, tell me what you did with your time. Tell me right now. And they have to tell me, or they can be fired, right? But now I can't just take that and say, you just incriminated yourself, my friend. Now I'm going to throw that over here and we're going to prosecute you. That's why those two don't meet. And that's a kind of haphazard way. So somewhere between Kathy as a labor attorney can do a better job, I think. But that's why we can't do it. You can't use criminal stuff with employee.
I appreciate the response, City Manager Lahanas. Yes, please, Commissioner Boyle.
Well, just one more. I mean, internal affairs can compel an officer to give up his right to remain silent and answer the questions that are presented to him or her. And that's why you can't use internal affairs statements made to the employer, because it's been determined that that would violate the United States Constitution. And the early cases even looked at it as an untrustworthy statement because it was compelled. So it goes even beyond not having an attorney present. It's just an untrustworthy statement. Furthermore, in Michigan now, there's a statute that specifically prohibits that. So.
But we don't get any of it. So I want to be clear, so what Commissioner Boyle has talked about is like, and what City Manager Lahanas is the Fifth Amendment right to, to incriminate, amendment to not incriminate oneself. But it's not that I don't get the statements that an individual makes. I don't get that investigation period, because it's so intertwined. And that's, I think, the hardest thing to explain, that you can have. That's why I used the bad doctor analogy. It was the best one I could come up with. I'm just trying to say a structure where you can have multiple different reviews, and they're all have different standards of proof, like Kathy referred to. They all have different outcomes, like money judgment versus termination of employment versus possible incarceration and criminal conviction. And so, there's an overlap, but they're not the same. They're not the same situation. And sometimes you have multiple ones. Like, say we have a homicide, we have the medical examiner may come back and not make a finding of homicide. They may make a finding of death, obvious, but not what the reason is. And then we will try to figure out, does this give us, if there's a situation where we don't have a clear-cut, person doing the homicide, what is the impact of that medical examiner making a determination of the form of death, and what does that do to with our criminal case as terms of evidence? We can't coerce, we can't make a finding exist that doesn't exist. That's not a good explanation.
No, I understand. I get it, and I appreciate everyone chiming in on that. And when you, and this will be my last question, and I know maybe we need to be moving on here soon with your time with respect to that. So, for example, in Lansing, you had a medical examiner make a determination of homicide in that case, if I'm not mistaken. But then you have the layers that City Manager Lahanas talked about and some of the issues that Commissioner Boyle came up with. Now, I know that didn't happen here, and I know that's kind of pending and all that kind of stuff. But, that's where I struggle with, is where you have a determination that is there, but then there's the uncertainty of even bringing charges available to whoever's involved. but then at the same time, these people, are still working and going on. So it's just really confusing from at least my personal perspective and kind of how you get around obvious determinations of something that has happened, like for a medical examiner, in a lot of these cases that we have involved, and where you still have such a hard time being able to bring that to the table and bringing that accountability there.
Well, so I'll give an example from when I was an assistant prosecutor. We had, I had two actually, but babies who died from traumatic brain injuries. It was homicide. We knew it was homicide. We didn't know who did it. We couldn't prove who did it because we had to prove who had access to that baby. And multiple people might have had access. And they either weren't talking or they were pointing their fingers at other people or whatever. So we have situations sometimes where someone dies and it's clearly a homicide, but we can't prove who did it. Or there's a connection, there's pieces that are not connecting. So though there are multiple pieces, and one, like the medical examiner, they can say it's not it's a natural death and we think it's a homicide. You can have a homicide but not have identified person who committed it. I mean, it is indeed very complicated, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but the pieces all have to line up for us to ethically pursue a case.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and kind of get to a certain point of this conversation. I know Commissioner Williams wanted to speak, and then Commissioner Harrell. Please go ahead.
Can the Oversight Commission get access to the Brady list?
Anyone can have that. I mean, we would make that available. Kara Berg, the media has gotten, and we gave it to USA Today 2 years ago. We'd have to, you might require a FOIA. Do we require a FOIA for that, Mike?
Yes, the quickest way to do that is simply file a FOIA request with the county's FOIA website and just make the request for the Brady list, and we can get that to you.
Thank you. Commissioner Rowe, please go ahead.
Just to sort of address your point, Chuck, I think a lot of the issue here is that there are things that sort of seem like common sense that butt up against the reality of the legal world. And this goes back to what we've talked about in a lot of these incidents being what we call lawful but awful, where we just look at them and like that shouldn't be happening, but they don't meet that legal standard. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are certain things that we are limited by due to the fact that they're out of our control, right? When we talk about the fact that there's no national use of force database, so we don't have any sense of what this issue looks like across the United States. There's no, we're pushing for the National Decertification Index, so that an officer is stripped of their badge and not allowed to go work, not just in a neighboring town, but in a neighboring state, right? In Illinois, they don't have contact with MCOL certified officers who have lost their job. An officer can go to Illinois and get their job, and we're none the wiser. So I think that's the important part of what we're doing here, is that we need to figure out ways to hold officers accountable, given that some of these other things are simply not possible or at the very least very difficult to do.
I appreciate that. And, I appreciate, because I know you are a professional researcher and this is your area. And I definitely am coming from a community standpoint as far as my overall understanding of this. And I think some of the questions that I have, a lot of people in the community have. And so hopefully you can bear with that. And I appreciate the patience and the answers to the questions in depth that you have given us. So I want to make sure that you understand that. Before we wrap things up, do any other commissioners who have not had a chance to speak want to chime in? Anyone want to have any final comments to our prosecutors here? All right, seeing none, I just want to say thank you to both of you. It was very, very helpful, insightful. We really, really, really appreciate that. I don't know if you can see, we got some silent claps going on in regards to your time and participation tonight. So we thank you for that.
Okay, and then I will leave. I talk too much, I'm sorry. But it is a conversation, and it's one that I'm really interested in continuing to have, because we look at how we're doing things all the time, and we want to do the best we can. We also want to push the envelope, that says, where does legislation need to occur? Where do other things need to occur that I can't control, but maybe my voice can be leveraged. That's something I'm really committed to doing, to using my position as the elected prosecutor, using my position as a white person. I want to use my privilege while I have it. So there may be times and places where that is another piece. And then we say, what are the structures that exist, and how can we make those structures that we have to live with more fair? So thank you for a chance to talk with you.
Thank you very, very much. We appreciate you. And if you don't mind, may I ask if any of the commissioners do get a little chance to process our conversation tonight, may we forward questions to you through via email and follow up by chance? Is that okay?
Of course.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time tonight. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. All right. Wow. That was a lot for me. I don't know about you, but that was a lot for me to kind of understand for the first time. We'll move on to item 4.1, to discussions of recommendations. And this is pertaining to section 3, and then going back to written communication and really having our focus come down to these recommendations and really having discussion so we can get to a certain point, because this area really is kind of one of the main key components to really building off what other people are doing in other sections. And so this discussion, I hope we get to a certain point of maybe a recommendation or an idea of recommendation about how we want to handle this. Before we get started, Commissioner Rowe, since you have done the work when no one's looking when it comes to this piece of information here, did you want to lay it up or make any comments before we open it up for discussion?
Sure, I can do that. So first thing to note is that last subsection, that implementation and evaluation section, is obviously not finished. My goal is to just sort of lay out in various stages, what this looks like nationally. I am looking for some recommendations from you all. I know City Manager Lahanis would say definitely put the Ann Arbor example in there. But a few examples that I will pop into the background section and the national trends section. But I think the most important part is really that aspect of the functions of oversight, right? There's clearly been a big push over the past few years, certainly since the President's Panel on Policing in the 21st Century, to focus more on function rather than style or structure. And so I think what that means is that most jurisdictions who are doing this, although it's still a fairly low number, lean more towards hybrid models that incorporate different elements based on the importance they're assigning to each function, right? And so at that point, then I think it becomes a question of, yes, we want to do each of these things as a function. Which of these is more important? Which of these is most likely? Which of these is most cost effective, right? And so I think that's where the overall conversation needs to be.
I would agree. And I definitely would like to start with functions and just kind of really getting a feel for the room, if you will, and kind of what you were thinking based off what he has submitted. And I'll open the floor up for comments. Yes, Vice Chair Root.
I want to make a comment about what we're trying to accomplish with this conversation. Cedric's section is section 3. That's what he's drafting. Tonight, what we're doing, as I understand it, is using that as a resource to begin our discussion of section 4. Which is the recommendations that we will want to make to the City Council for East Lansing. So we're using Cedric's piece, which is the national context, as a guide for us to talk about what we want to specifically recommend for East Lansing. So what I'm hoping will be happening in the next however long we spend, at least a half an hour, I'm sure, is trying to come to some consensus on some specific functions, starting with functions, and maybe we'll get to some of the structural models as well. So that as we continue the discussion at further meetings, we've got some kind of consensus about, yes, we're going to be dealing with policy recommendations, for example, and we can look at that in more detail. Or yes, we have certain ideas about dealing with complaints, and we'll look at that in more detail later. So this is the first time we're really trying to move from having interesting conversations and kind of, it sounds like we're on the same page on a lot of things maybe, to actually kind of testing out, are we wanting to recommend X as a general idea? And then if so, that'll be in the minutes. And then we know that will be what we'll develop in more detail next. Is that helpful?
Very helpful. Thank you, Vice Chair. Yes, Commissioner Hurrell, please go ahead.
So before I forgot, I just wanted to mention the work that Eric did that was in the written communications from before about the mental health initiatives. So that's one of those things where part of our discussion, I think, today was where to put things in terms of the report. And so I viewed, and so I wanted input on Eric's work. I viewed Eric's work as being folded into that fourth function of critical incident prevention. And so I'm looking for input as to where that might be put. So, right, one of the concerns being that so the city of East Lansing now has 2 social workers embedded with the police department. And so then maybe we're looking at what Eric wrote in the context of which of those models should those 2 social workers be following, right? We're not making a recommendation. The city of East Lansing should have some mental health capacities within ELPD because they already do, right? We're trying to make a recommendation of what should that look like, because that's still a fairly new process. And so that's where that piece would come in, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. I'll open it up for that discussion. Give me some feedback on what you got from how we should really talk about that formulation of the functions based on what you got, as far as us coming to a consensus on that.
One idea is to talk about, is to leave complaints until a little bit later because it's so complicated, and to maybe look at, and that's a lot of what independent investigations is, although it's maybe not entirely, but these other functions that Cedric has are community outreach, public information, and critical incident prevention, which has a couple different parts to it. Maybe we could start with those and see what consensus we can reach on those. Does that make sense to people? Just as a way to actually move forward.
So does anyone have any comments in regards to community outreach as far as a function and what you foresee?
Do people agree that the Oversight Commission will have some function of community outreach?
See a head nod from Commissioner Boyle. Did you want to say something, Commissioner Ellsworth-Etchison?
Well, no, I was just going to comment on the community outreach portion because I think that's going to be so critical to building trust or rebuilding trust. And so what that community outreach may look like, we have to still determine,
But you are in consensus that that's going to be a critical function for us to have going forward within the oversight.
Yes.
And I believe Commissioner Boyle is in consensus with that. Yes, Commissioner Josephson.
I was going to say that I agree as well. This kind of segues briefly, and I don't know if you guys watched that documentary that I had forwarded out to everybody, because towards the end, at around 44 minutes or so, they talk about a Newark street team. And it's like a group of community members who are kind of like trained to help the citizens with things that sometimes the police would respond to because people just call 911 for a lot of things. And so these street team people are placed outside of schools or outside of like more troubled residences and different businesses, and they're just there to assist. And they give out these flyers that say, call us for these things. And so that's just maybe like a way that like the review board, or not the review board, the committee can maybe help organize a group of like street team members or whatever we want to call them. So maybe they can also help voice in the community as well, because then it's not as official.
Thank you. I didn't get a chance to see that video just yet, but I plan on definitely taking advantage of that. Yes, Commissioner Harrell.
So that type of initiative is fairly common, and there are various emphases, right? I mean, Chicago has violence interrupters. In Boston, during the Boston ceasefire project, Operation Ceasefire, they had local faith leaders reaching out. I was wondering if maybe Chief Johnson or Deputy Chief Gonzalez might talk a little bit about what the neighborhood teams do. I just happened to notice that that's what former Commissioner Williams was now doing with the East Lansing Police Department. So our loss, your gain, I suppose. But I was just wondering what sorts of things they do, if that might fall under this sort of community outreach type of function.
Yeah, good evening. You're absolutely right. What Commissioner Josephson is talking about, we have 4 part-time neighborhood resource specialists on board currently. And they're on all the different shifts, and they work pretty much from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock in the following day. And they are handling or they're dealing with calls that are not police related. We may get called on a call or like a noise complaint or neighbor complaint or any kind of intervention that we are identifying that a police officer is not needed. These resource specialists are, they have the leeway to go and intervene and have contact with the neighbors or whatever situations, the business people downtown with noise complaints and things of that nature. So they are actually working along those exact same lines, and we're pretty excited about what they have to offer to us, and they're pretty excited about it too. So we're forming different calls for service and things what they're going to be responding to. So that's in the process, and of course the stuff that we're learning from in our meetings, with our group, every 2 weeks. I think they're going to take some of that information too to come up with other ways they can intervene and be more resourceful to the police department and resourceful to the community also.
Thank you, Chief Johnson. And I must say that I've already heard great things, good things, I just say, in regards to the potentiality of the impact that those workers will have. I was on an email chain of a neighborhood association, and they had contact with one of those people, and they were very, very excited to build that relationship and really address some longstanding issues that haven't really been resolved for a period of time. They were really optimistic about their impact on that issue. So I just want to say that to you out loud.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries. So anyone else have a comment, want to continue on with the discussion? Yes, Commissioner Josephson.
I just want to ask for clarification. How many members of that group did you say that there were?
We have 4 part-time employees that's working for us. And right now, because we try and get the maximum coverage, they're pretty much working by themselves right now on all the shifts, starting from 9 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock in the following morning. So they work together as a team, but normally they have their own shift, and our patrol supervisors are responsible for getting them to the calls where they could be needed and could be utilized. And they also are asked to intervene on their own. Just, we call it jump a call, but they can go ahead and just intervene and say, I'll take that call instead of the police officer. So they're getting a little more comfortable with the radio, getting a little comfortable with calls they feel comfortable going on without police intervention. So we have 4 part-timers. So they're working by themselves right now, along with the police officers, but they got their own car. They have uniforms that are the citizens can understand who they are. They're not police related, but at least they know they're from the city. And we're here to help any way we can. So.
I don't know if I
Thank
can
you, Chief
just
Johnson.
respond.
Yes, please go ahead, Commissioner Josephson.
I think I'm not doing the video justice in explaining exactly like what they're very like informal, and there's about 5 to 6 of them in a group that walk the sidewalks and are there just for like a community impact. And it's just to like just show that like there's another group in the community that's trying to like do good and like keep like crime down and, you know, help kids stay in school. It's more of like that, and they give out brochures saying like, you know, if you have a problem, anything on this list, call us or like a social worker. And then when it escalates, then they call that next person. So it's almost like a step down before that one social worker who would have to be driven around by police officers regardless. There's more of them at once walking around.
Right. Yeah, our social workers and our neighborhood resource specialists, they have their own cars, so they're not with the police. But they're not in a group though. We don't have enough for a group concept. But just along those same lines, we actually we're getting our neighborhood watch groups together. And so that may be something that our neighborhood resource specialists can work within our neighborhood watch groups, who actually can come up with maybe more of a citizen type of group instead of city employees, you know, in this. So there could be some volunteering that we can see. We can try and initiate some of those discussions in some of our neighborhood watch groups that they may want to take something on and make one of their projects in their own particular neighborhood. So I think that's something we can delve into a little bit.
Thank you, Chief Johnson. Before you go, Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton, I just want to comment on that. What you said, Commissioner Josephson, and I'll kind of keep this brief, but I got to tell you, my first interaction with law enforcement was in the neighborhood that I was in, and they were passing out football cards of the professional team of the city that I lived in. And they were really active in being a representative of law enforcement or public safety in a way that was positive in that outreach. And I got to tell you, you cannot underestimate that, because when you think about first contact with minority youth in our community and others around that first initial contact compared to white young kids is totally polar opposites. And responding to calls and being a second responder into some of those different issues really has a lot of value. And I'm really thankful that we had that in play. But I also want to extend, and I haven't seen Commissioner Josephson's video yet, but I would suspect it was really something along those lines in a way that it's really, really important that you have contact with the young people in this community, as well as the college students as well, but especially the young people in this community, especially with a lot of communities of kids coming into our community who don't even live here. Because we have the way that our school system is set up. I just really think that is something that can really, really be a gem in what you do and really leading the nation in a lot of different ways when it comes to that kind of advocacy. Please, Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton.
So my comment was, it really dovetails off what you were just saying, Commissioner Grigsby, was my mother lives in Auburn Hills, and her subdivision is like insane on Halloween. Like, I've never seen how many kids like are driven into that subdivision from other communities like Pontiac and so forth. And the police they bring a very positive force when they come. They're on their bicycles, and they have like their bicycles are kind of decked out with, decorations and lights, and they're giving out candy, and they're giving out reflectors to the kids. And so it will allow those kids not to like see the police as, this very scary being for their first encounter with the police. And so that's how, when I think of like that community involvement, was when there are events going on in the city, particularly like outdoor events, that the police, obviously there has to be some police there to patrol it because, of potential for bad actors or whatever. But also like there's a segment there that's actually engaged, like part of the celebratory event, as opposed to you just there to make sure everybody, stays in line. And I think, having that wonderful, positive experience. I was like, I went right up to the police officer, when I saw this, because obviously I don't live in Pontiac and I don't have an opportunity to see my mom on Halloween, but when I did a few years ago, I was amazed and impressed, and I went over and thanked the cops for being out there. And obviously they're patrolling as well, but they don't look like they're patrolling, right? They're not in their car, they're on the bike, and they're still keeping their eyes, to what's going on. And it makes you feel safe because there are kids being driven in from all over the place. And so I think that's what I'm looking for. How can we get the police engaged in that kind of way?
Well said. Please go ahead, Chief Johnson.
No, I think the commission has been eavesdropping in our staff meetings because we actually had a staff meeting just last week, and we had all of our command, we had our social workers, we had one of our officers in there. We went around the room one by one to say, okay, how can we engage this community? And it was so funny because everyone started going around, they started coming up with their own ideas, and at the end of the meeting, we started realizing like 3/4 of the ideas all was related to kids, either through something with some kind of activity with the children, or getting PAL back up and running, or getting into the community. Our bike program came up. So it's actually quite interesting. These are police officers who come up with ideas how we can re-engage the community, and easily 3/4 of the ideas centered around children somehow, one way or the other. So it was actually a great exercise that we did. And it was good to hear that kind of stuff. And these are our supervisors who work the streets. So that's we're excited about what's going on, what's going to happen in the future. So.
Thank you, Chief Johnson. Yes, Vice Chair Root, and then Councilmember Bacon, and then Commissioner Boyle, former council member.
Let me know if this is helpful. We've been having a positive, interesting conversation, but I think it has changed the subject from the one we need to be having, because we're talking about what functions should the Oversight Commission have. That is our task in this part of our meeting. And one of the ways it's easy to slip from that focus is that the word community and the word outreach are used, by everybody for all sorts of good things. What we're trying to talk about, everything in this part of the conversation, is a function of the Oversight Commission that we're going to recommend. So for this conversation, when we're talking about community outreach, what we're talking about is, should the Oversight Commission that we propose for East Lansing have a community outreach function? And what Cedric's draft suggests, very briefly, is that outreach function to the community would include helping people understand the complaint process, because that's part of oversight, and also would collect concerns of the community about policing, because the commission is trying to provide some oversight about complaints, and I hope also about policy. We'll get to that. So the commission is trying to represent the community and not just come up with its own ideas. So those are what I understand about the community outreach function of the Oversight Commission. And that's what we're trying to hone in on, and not talk about what good ideas we have for what the police department should do for their community outreach. That is a different subject. We're trying to make recommendations about the Oversight Commission.
Thank you, Vice Chair Root. As always, thank you for bringing me back to earth and what we're focusing on. I think Councilmember Bacon is up, and then Commissioner Boyle.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Root kind of stole some of my thunder, but I think the focus, the real point of emphasis, obviously all that stuff's really nice. It's the stop is where the officers presented with danger, the individuals presented with danger, where there's the other side of Grand River that doesn't know how our stop's supposed to go. There's people, we're a broad community that expands to 200,000 people on game day. I think it's more important to focus the stop. How's the stop at the end, that interaction right there? That's where, all this other stuff is nice to have, and what type of focus is on the stop. Like, what's that supposed to look like? What type of oversight on the stop? That's where the most things can go wrong, in my opinion. And I don't know if the police officials on here would agree. I haven't seen anywhere else where any of this stuff has gone left, other than in the stop, and how it's reported and what's been reportable and what's been not reported, and this, that, and the other, and every single part of that relates back to that stop. So I think kind of everything else is nice, but I think how we review and how we look at the stop and complaints around the stop and things like that seems to be the only true place where you can get in tons of where that interaction and everybody's in jeopardy because of this in that stop scenario. So I think that's the focus. So what's up?
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. Commissioner Boyle, and then Commissioner Harrell, please go ahead.
Well, actually, I'm pretty much in step with Councilmember Bacon and Vice Chair Root in that, yes, what we need is community outreach by the commission, because that's the only way the commission will really be of service to the community. If the community is aware of the commission and what it does and how the procedures work and what the commission can deal with and what it can't deal with, and perhaps it can even send you in a different direction if that's where you need to go if you have a complaint or concern. So I think it's an essential part of the commission that there be open and frequent outreach to the community as a whole. Certainly through the neighborhood associations in East Lansing is one way to do it, but as Councilmember Bacon noted, we're dealing with a community that almost doubles on some game days. And as far as police interactions go, they're interacting with that community as well. So it's a larger community than just East Lansing itself.
Right. Right.
Well said, Commissioner Boyle. Commissioner Harrell, please go ahead.
I think Commissioner Boyle makes an important point. Right. The question here is, what does that community outreach look like? And so is that, a monthly listening session? Is that another survey more specifically targeted towards specific groups, as Councilmember Bacon noted? Maybe it's, we send it out to season ticket holders. What are, some of the issues that you might have in terms of how, contacts are handled on game days or things like that, and some of that is potentially problematic in that now we're reaching out towards getting the MSU Police Department involved on those game day functions and things like that, right? So I think that all we can do, again, to sort of tighten things up is sort of define, what does community outreach look like? Is that meeting once a month to hear vague complaints from the citizenry, right? Not to take and initiate a specific complaint, but to hear a group of people saying, you know what? I got stopped the other day and nobody told me why, really. And when they did tell me why, it just seemed like they were kind of just making some stuff up. And if that's something that we're hearing consistently in these listening sessions, then that impacts how the oversight body does its job in terms of maybe we need to revise the policy on this, or maybe we need to look at why there is a policy that exists, but it's not being followed consistently by officers, right? I think that's what we're talking about in this community outreach component.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, accessibility in contact. Thank you. Any other commissioners have any more comments in regards to community outreach? I mean, we're definitely in consensus from what I feel that is something that, we need to have established within that.
Okay.
All right. So can we move to public information and just talk about that for a second, and what your ideas about that as far as the Oversight Commission and how they would go about that? Or even if you think that that's something that they should be focusing on in regards to your recommendations or understanding of how they will be functioning. Please go ahead, Commissioner Harrell.
Sorry, not trying to dominate the discussion here, but in terms of public information, I think we're looking, as a social scientist, right? I look at this from the standpoint of give me as much data as possible, I'll figure out what to do with it, right? So I don't know if the East Lansing Police Department has an analyst on site, or if they just, they turn over their crime mapping data to crimemapping.com, and that gets churned out that way. But so for example, when Ms. Siemon says something about the Vera Institute of Justice coming in to look at their data, right? I don't know how many people know that that's going on. I didn't know that was going on, right? So in terms of public information, I think this is figuring out how do we maximize the oversight body's intake of data and then maximize that output in a way that makes sense to people, right? Editors hate me because one of the things they always say is, you're writing too much for an academic audience, right? So feel free to, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, edit me down. But there has to be a process of us making all of this information easily digestible by the community.
I would agree with that 1,000%, and, one thing that came to mind when you were talking was accessibility to the data. There's one thing to have too much of it and knowing how to process and churn it out. But I mean, the baby stages of what I feel is it needs to be something that they need to have access to and be empowered to be able to ask for is that data. So they're able to look at other issues such as policy recommendations and different things and practices that they pursue within what they got going on. So I'm just saying what you're saying, I think, but in a lot dumbed down version. Commissioner Williams and then Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
I understand that when you're talking to the public, a newspaper or blog or any kind of communication with the public, statistics put people to sleep, but people like stories. So I'm one who favors getting as many stories out there as possible. I was impressed by Steve Gonzalez's stories that he told about the use of force incidents that he wrote up, and I absorbed those a lot more easily than I absorb numbers. So I would hope that the commission would go through incidents and reports and so forth and put stories out to the public about how the East Lansing police handle this, that, or the other kind of stop and problem. So I hope that would be a part of this public information dissemination, stories.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. I believe it was Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison was up. They raised their hand. Was that okay?
Yeah, my question is more towards the repository and the dissemination of the information. Will that be an interior page on the city's website or pages, or will the Oversight Commission have their own website? What does this look like? Because I don't know what that looks like for other communities that might have this. So I'm just kind of asking that question for those that may have done some research on that and may know how that's usually handled.
That's a very good question. Does anyone have any points of reference or experience seeing what that may look like? I believe Vice Chair Root may have. And Commissioner Garcia Jr., please go ahead.
So I'm a little surprised at the lack of data that's provided by the police department. And I'll just say that with the Lansing Police Department, our annual report covered a lot of the data that I think we're trying to get East Lansing or this locality to provide, and that's use of force data, demographics applied to that, crime rates, districts by district, all that information can be seen on an annual report. And I'm not saying that we should only do it in an annual report in an annual increment. I think it should be more, but just as an example, somebody asked for an example, that's kind of like how it was at the Lansing Police Department, that information was provided through an annual report. And it's certainly something that we could see here. I have looked at the annual report for the city and doesn't show much about the police department.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out, Commissioner Garcia. Now, when you look at the Lansing information there, does the annual reporting, just for example, does that go back more than 1 or 2 years, or does that show previous years in?
No, it's just for that year that it's that annual report is for.
Thank you. I believe Vice Chair Root and then Commissioner
The
Harrell.
Lansing Police Department also now has an open data website that has quite a number of spreadsheets available. One is on complaints. One is on, I've forgotten what the other things are on. And some of those go back a while. And they've got this new structure of an online website with data that can be downloaded and analyzed. So, Chuck was talking about how is the data accessible. This is accessible for the public and also for researchers. And, the plan, I think, is to keep adding to that data. That's the kind of, one kind of additional way that some police departments are making information available to the community. So you've got the annual report, but you've also got an open data on the website. So I think, I hope that the Oversight Commission will think a lot about, I think Cedric did a great job of summarizing the data needs of the Oversight Commission and the role of the Oversight Commission in making data accessible and meaningful to the public. I also hope that the Oversight Commission can be in conversation with the police department about the issues Noel just raised, about what information the police department will make available.
Was that a no to my question?
Kelly, I don't know the answer to your question. That's
Okay.
my real answer. It's a good one. I am sure that a website is really important. I'm also sure that independence is really important.
I can also just mention all of our boards and commissions have their own website within the city's website. They have their own page with their commission members, with contacts, with important information.
Okay, thank you.
Relevant forms and all that.
Yeah.
You could link it from the police department's page, from the front page. That's all up to, our structure, but they all commissions have their own web page within our website.
Okay.
Whether
thank you.
an oversight commission should be different because its independence is so important, I'm not sure. But at least, as George says, every commission has its own web page. I
just wanted to make sure my question was addressed.
There will have to be connections to the city website because, for example, there will be meetings of this commission that will be public meetings. It will have agendas and will have videos, and it will use the city's system for that, I'm sure.
As I look at the review boards across the country, they almost all have their own website where they
I would think so.
It may be connected to the city, of course, but it's theirs.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. I believe Commissioner Harrell wanted to chime in on that.
Yeah, I think the Oversight Commission needs to be a neutral arbiter, essentially, between the community and the police department, right? And so what I mean by that is that, yes, these conversations need to happen with ELPD about what information could be made available, but to Eric's point, right, it can't just be a data dump of here's a spreadsheet, because a lot of people are not going to bother to download that spreadsheet, or if they do, they're not going to know what to do with it, right? One of the things that tends to happen is, particularly in jurisdictions that have smaller crime rates, and Noel can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was one year where Lansing had, I think, 14 homicides, and the next year it had 17. And then all of a sudden it was reported as, this 33% or 25% increase in homicides, and people were freaking out, right? So part of the job of the commission needs to be contextualizing the information that's coming out to educate the public.
Yeah, I really loved how you brought that back around to what you said originally. And the key word, I believe, from all that was educating the public. And I really value that because there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of transparency questions and trust issues. I mean, it just is what it's going to be until we can kind of educate, like this is why this happened. This is why we don't know. This is why we do know. This is what we did about it. It's such a great way, even if you don't get the answers you want, to be able to deal with the issues that are at hand. And then again, for this oversight to be able to recommend going forward in improving those situations. Did anyone else want to comment just particularly, because I think we're in consensus of that public information and the data and how important it is. Is there any other comments or follow up to what you've heard? Yes, please, Vice Chair Root.
I'd like to mention one other thing so that we won't forget it. We have kind of an unusual situation in East Lansing where we're setting up an oversight commission at the same time as the police department is beginning the accreditation process. And the accreditation process has, many standards, 108. Some of them have to do, and many of them have to do with issues of interest to the Oversight Commission. We happen to be talking now about public information. The accreditation standards have some standards about information and reports for the police to do. So I think we might want to explore the opportunity, and also Deputy Chief Gonzalez explained to us that you're doing this 2 years to make promises, and then you'll be doing 3 years where you have to prove that the promises were kept. The Oversight Commission will also be doing sometimes some reviews of policy. It may be that we could work in conjunction with each other sometimes about if the Oversight Commission will have some responsibilities in terms of data availability to the community. If we can understand from the police how they are going to be changing what they provide about data and information as a part of becoming accredited, that will help us see, okay, the police are going to do this, and then the Oversight Commission can do this in addition. I just think that the possibility of building off of accreditation is something I'd like to put on our radar screen.
I think that's a great point. I'd be curious to hear if, Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson could maybe respond to that, to see if there's openness within that structure with the accreditation process, or if you don't know, you don't know. But if that's something that dynamic as far as working with the Oversight Commission would be something you think is possible.
Yeah, I personally think that working with the Oversight Commission and accreditation at the same time is possible, but we do have to understand that the standards are the standards. And if, for example, the Oversight Commission says, we don't like, standard X, and you should tailor your policy away from that standard, then we won't be able to meet that standard or get a, we won't be able to get a waiver, if you will, from MACP to achieve that accreditation. MACP does give waivers for standards, but it's my understanding the only standards that they will waive is if it doesn't apply to your police department. So for example, they have a standard on reserve police officers. We don't have a reserve program, so we would apply for and get a waiver on that. So yeah, while we're doing this concurrently, we're definitely going to have to make sure that both sides of the coin, accreditation and oversight, are aware of each other, and we work together on making sure that we achieve both goals between the two.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Gonzalez. And I think we're all understanding that's definitely what we want to do. Obviously we can't have oversight that's going against the accreditation process in some of the different ways that you would have to comply with. But we definitely think, working with, alongside, and understanding that process for the oversight, it will help them be able to work in coalition with you going forward. Any other comments in regards to public information, thoughts, ideas that come to mind as discussion? I think we're in consensus that that's important, that we need to kind of really have that folded in to what we're going to end up having. Yes, Councilmember Bacon.
I think to back up and kind of come back to Steve's point, I think that would be part of the communication, though. If there's something that seems to be rubbing in the community or being taken the wrong way, but it's part of the accreditation process, that to the Oversight Commission, Steve would report that, and the Oversight Commission would somehow disseminate that to the community. This is the why of why this looks like this. This is part of the accreditation process. This is a state standard. This is not an East Lansing thing, blah, blah, blah. That's when that would actually activate, from a positive sense, the Oversight Commission having to explain to the community the why of this. This isn't some East Lansing thing that we're doing ad hoc and that kind of thing. So it would have to work both ways. So that would be an important thing if there's something that's rubbing the community the wrong way, but is essential to the accreditation process. So I think that would be some type of reporting or back and forth exchange that needs to happen between the police, the commission, and then out to the community via the commission. So that may be something we need to talk about, because we don't want to disrupt the process, but we also don't want to put things into the culture, because ultimately this is about culture. This is about whatever else, and what happens in the car and between that pane of glass is really where this all happens at. So it's a culture issue broadly. So we want to protect the officer and protect the community at the same time. So stuff has to be explained to them if it's part of their accreditation. So that's just kind of broadly.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. And I think the key word in there is that communication. And that is very, very valuable in this business when it comes to what we want to do with our mission at hand and going forward. Any other comments in regards to specifically public information? Okay, good. So critical incident prevention. I'd love to hear kind of really where you're at with that. This is, I think, kind of complex, but does anyone want to chime in on what their thoughts on what that looks like and the necessity of that? Yes, Commissioner Boyle.
Well, I sort of looked at this and thought, well, we really want more than preventing critical incidents, don't we? We want just to improve overall the interactions between the police department and the citizenry and the visitors to East Lansing. Although certainly we want to prevent something that looks like it might be a problem from becoming a problem. Those warning systems of when it looks like you have a police officer who's tending to not conform to the standards that we want. But I think we want, certainly that's a goal, isn't it? I mean, the goal of the commission is to make changes where necessary to improve the police department, or recommend changes. I mean, obviously they can't make the changes, but recommend changes where necessary to improve things in the city of East Lansing.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyle. Vice Chair Root.
I think what Kathy just said is really helpful, that critical incident prevention is a good point to include. There are other points that should also be included, not just subsumed onto that. And I think one of those other points that isn't in the outline yet is making policy recommendations. I would put that as a separate point. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I would make that one as a separate one.
Thank you, Vice Chair Root. Councilmember Bacon, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of back up on Commissioner Boyle's comments, I think ultimately if the culture's set a certain way, officers and the law enforcement leadership are aware how the commission works and the effectiveness of it, some things should impact culture in a way where maybe we're looking, it's like manufacturing, you're looking at 0 by 365. Like it didn't appear because the exposure of X is too dire, or the commission is too on top of these types of things for these infractions and these types of things. So you're looking at 0 by 365, and that's okay. But we're still working on policy and other things on the other side of it. So kind of off of what Commissioner Root was saying. So it is kind of two-pronged, but ultimately the fact that the commission exists should be a buffer or something maybe in there from both sides of the interaction that goes, you know what, I don't ultimately really, when decision making, I don't feel like dealing with them. I don't want this going before them and somebody. I don't want a decision where officers making decisions that's life threatening, but there might be a decision where it's just not worth having to deal with this commission and yada yada. But sometimes that's okay, that extra layer of accountability. So ultimately 0 by 365 is the goal. I mean, that's what it's going to take to change culture, because what's really happening is, the next event, the next incident just allows people to not do commerce in East Lansing, to not do that, to not come through East Lansing. Like, I don't deal with East Lansing. East Lansing's this. And so the next incident is that answer. So really it behooves everyone to not have the next incident, so that's ultimately the goal. It's like the terrorist only has to be right once. These incidents only have to happen once. So it is that on the incident side, it's that big. Then what we're doing on the policy side and those recommendations, it's kind of 2 tracks, in my opinion. So, because we've had our sets of incidents, and it's going to take a very long time to undo the impact to outside communities and perception. It takes a long time to undo perception. So no matter what we're doing in here. So that's the point, and that everybody should be on board with that part of it. We need to go 0 365 with none of this stuff happening realistically to change any type of perception long term. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, Councilmember Bacon. When I think of this and I think of function, I go back to the early warning system that we had talked about previously, and having the prevention aspect within that early warning system. I know, again, that Michigan State Police has a system in place, and it really helps them be able to have very detailed information before things possibly get to a certain point. I think it was Albuquerque or maybe somewhere in Phoenix that, they even have their system set up in a way where they get reports out to the Oversight Commission. And based on kind of how they're set up, they don't really give the specific officer's name and things like that, but they do give them out the incident reports that happen in a period of time. And it's a great way, again, going back to the education, going back to the policy recommendations, going back to some of the different things we talked about, how not only is that system very valuable for the East Lansing Police Department, but it's very valuable for the Oversight Commission to be able to have access to what that information has represented and what's going on, so then they can jump in there and be a part of the early warning system. That's what comes to mind for me when I think about this particular portion of this thing. But please go ahead if anyone else has anything else to say. Yes, Vice Chair Root.
I've got a question to Cedric about this. My understanding of early warning systems have been that is an internal component of accountability. Can you help me understand, can you articulate what role you think the Oversight Commission should play in regard to the East Lansing Police Department having an early warning system or early intervention system?
So from, I guess, the simplest standpoint, right, the first thing I'm looking at is, a recommendation to the Oversight Commission that the Oversight Commission establish an early warning system. If that is established via the ELPD having something in place for, buying a new system from a different vendor or whatever it is, and then receiving reports from that system, I think that would work. If ELPD does not have that system in place, then I think it would be incumbent upon the Oversight Commission to ask for that type of data and compile that report themselves.
I thought an early warning system was designed to be used not only for the data collection, but for supervision, and that's why it was internal.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the Oversight Commission is not going to be involved in supervision. We need a police department that is well supervised, and adding an early warning system will help it be well supervised.
Right. So yeah, the point of an early warning system, right, is to give shift supervisors a heads up that this might be a problem officer down the line, right? It's
right. Exactly.
sort of non-disciplinary, outside of internal affairs, sometimes as informal as, hey, your name has popped up in the system a few times, or, these particular incidents that you've been involved with have been flagged for review. Let's just talk through that process with me, right? They are able to be used, I think, to identify sort of systematic issues, right? Mm-hmm. So whereas I see East Lansing, if they have that system in place, using that for shift supervisor to have those conversations, anytime that we get the oversight body might get batch reports about, in the last 6 months, this many incidents have been flagged, right? Again, without necessarily giving us specific officer information, that sort of, right? This number of incidents have been flagged, and it has been in these parts of town, in these districts, it has been on these shifts, it has been of these types of incidents, right? Allegations of unprofessional conduct. Somebody didn't want to file an official complaint, but writes a letter to Chief Johnson and says, hey, I didn't appreciate that this happened, right? I think that's still a way for, the oversight body's not supervising individual officers or dealing with specific incidents, but looking at that body of work and saying, hey, the last 6 months we've seen an increase in the number of flagged incidents over, people arguing about why they were stopped, or people complaining that officers have been racial profiling, or whatever that, that batch of complaints is, then that might lead to some of those policy discussions that we're talking about for policy review.
That is exactly what I needed to hear. That is so helpful.
Yeah, what he said.
I understand it better. Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
So that makes it clear how it's useful internally and how it's useful to an external oversight commission. That was perfect.
It's a beautiful thing. All right. Anyone else?
Are there any types of any functions of an oversight commission that are missing from this? I think we've pulled out that recommending policy would get sort of moved to the higher level of the outline. But are there any other functions that we haven't mentioned at all that we think should be functions of an oversight commission? Okay.
All right. Does that answer your question, Vice Chair Root?
Yep.
All right. So we have independent investigations on here.
Right.
And how do you want to tackle this?
Well, I think it depends partly on how long this meeting is going to go. We could start this conversation now and continue it next time. Or we could decide that next time we're going to devote our discussion of recommendations to how to deal with complaints.
Maybe we should just finish up this section here. So then the next time we're starting off in the complaints solely. But I'm more than happy to hear any feedback on what you think from anyone. Commissioner Raw?
We take a vote count on whether people think the oversight body should be able to initiate and originate complaints versus just review.
Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
That was yes.
Anyone else? Yes, Vice Chair Root.
Do you know some commissions that do that in other cities? Initiate complaints?
And initiate complaints, it's very rare. They're out there, but they're rare.
Mm-hmm.
What would be an example of that?
Yeah.
I'd have to look through my list again. I don't have one in mind offhand.
Commissioner Garcia, did you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, again, I keep talking about back then, but at Lansing Police Department, the city of Lansing had a separate investigator by the name of Bernard Brantley when I was in internal affairs that was also an independent investigator for the city of Lansing. In other words, if a complainant came to the city of Lansing to file a complaint, they didn't like what I had to say as the lieutenant in charge of internal affairs, they could go to Bernard Brantley at the city of Lansing. That's kind of an example of an independent investigator, but it was under the authority of the city of Lansing, so maybe not completely separate from the police department. Those were challenging investigations because we're supposed to work together. He would present an investigation, show me the results, and then we'd kind of come to a conclusion. So it wasn't ideal in that sense, but that's an example, I guess I could say.
Thank you. Commissioner Rowe?
I'm pretty sure San Francisco does, and probably Los Angeles. But again, I don't know offhand, and I would be surprised if any jurisdiction the size of East Lansing, both in terms of city size and agency personnel, has a body that originates complaints. All right, and this is just one of those things that goes back to a financial wherewithal question, right? And now you're talking about having full-time paid staff that have to be trained, that are, that's all they do in order to do that process right. Anytime you're talking about originating an investigation, having part-time volunteer staff is not anywhere near adequate, right? So, if that's something that City Manager Lahanas thinks the city has the stomach for, but we're talking about 2 full-time investigators at conservatively $65,000 a year. That's in addition to any training. One thing that I have been kicking around, and one of the things that Ms. Siemon said sort of brought this to mind again was, a regional authority, right? I think it might be possible to, or ideally, to have sort of a monitor or some sort of oversight body that is full-time and professional at the level of Ingham County. But I have no idea how much taste for that is out there, right? I'll tell you that as a graduate student, we tried to organize something with Ingham County just in terms of information sharing. And there were a couple of jurisdictions that wanted nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
So just a quick answer then. So can the commission members or this committee initiate complaints, or are we only talking about initiating the investigation themselves? Because obviously they could initiate a complaint, right? And they could ask the chief to look into something perhaps and be the complainant, or can they do that and then have their own investigator? And I think that when you look at the size of East Lansing and the volume of complaints, period, I think that would be a very tall order in terms of people sitting around 95% of the time, but that's just the first thought of it.
Yeah, I think it would certainly be reasonable to have the oversight body be able to provide complaint intake. But like City Manager Lahana said, just based on the number of incidents that we've had to this point, and I understand each of these is serious and certainly of utmost importance to the people making these complaints. I don't know if the city would be able to justify that expense of a full-time professional investigator.
Agreed. And I know Commissioner Williams, you have something to say, and I just want to let you guys be mindful. We are going into the extra half hour or so when we still have a little bit more to go. So I don't mean to be disrespectful and cut anyone off. This is important discussion, but we do need to kind of get to a place going forward. Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
We should be cognizant that there are different definitions of what a complaint is. There are personnel complaints, And then there are complaints about policy deficiencies or operational deficiencies. I see no reason why the commission, even if it wouldn't be in a position of instigating a personnel complaint against a particular officer, would not want to be involved in observing a deficiency in the way the policy is written or, practices are carried out, and complaining about that and asking the police department to investigate that deficiency.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Vice Chair Root.
Eric, can you help me understand, or maybe Cedric can too, what would be the difference between the Oversight Commission making a complaint to the department about a policy versus the Oversight Commission making a recommendation about a policy matter?
Was that to me?
Well, whoever's got it, no, either Eric or Cedric, because they've been talking about it.
I think there are different definitions of complaint, and that's what I was saying, that there could be a complaint which essentially is a recommendation about a policy change or a practice change.
Well, if we already have identified that we have a function for the Oversight Commission about making policy recommendations, does that cover that matter? Or is having a complaint about policy different from making a recommendation about policy?
Well, are you saying that the only kind of complaint that is in the is being contemplated is a complaint against an individual officer seeking discipline?
I was trying to understand what we were talking about, whether talking about a complaint about policy is the same as talking about a recommendation about policy, or if it's different. If it's the same, we could agree to use the same words, and that would be helpful.
I think it could be the same as a recommendation.
Okay.
A change.
It sounded similar to me. Okay.
Yes, and Commissioner Rose in agreement with that, so I think we're in consensus.
Okay.
On that point.
And people are used to thinking about a complaint as a complaint about an individual officer. So it would be handy if we don't use that word for something else and leave that meaning in the more common usage. And so we can use recommendation when we're talking about policy.
Understood.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
It's been really helpful.
Yes, it very is. It is. And so I think, we have quite a bit left in regards to, so I'm wondering what commissioners are thinking as far as our discussion going further with bleeding into the models and having that be a discussion that we have now, or we table that.
Get down.
What's that? Hey, hello?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm yelling at my dog. Shoot, I was not muted.
So for the sake of time, can you give me some feedback, commissioners? And the best way to have this discussion, because I know we have done a lot of tonight, and I want to make sure that we don't, just because we're going on, we lose people and we lose the heart of the conversation. Is anyone open to being able to take the second part of section 3 that we had set up for tonight in the models and kind of bring that over to our next meeting and having that discussion, or is that too disruptive? Anyone against that at all? Let's put it that way, because I think that's what we need to do to have a very robust conversation with that. So we're going to do that, Diane, just for your understanding of kind of how we're going to do that. We're going to bleed that over to the next one there. And then we're going to leave this section here. I think we're at a good point of moving on from that. And what we have next is item 5.1. And this is the follow-up questions. And so I'm not quite sure how long this conversation will go, but if we do go into this, I really want to make sure that we're very mindful of our time tonight, because we will have additional conversation in regards to these specific questions in the next set of information that Deputy Chief Gonzalez and Chief Johnson is going to provide for us. So we won't be leaving anything behind, but I just want to make sure if there's something tonight you needed to answer in regards to item 5.1, or you wanted to talk about that briefly tonight, let's do that. So we're on item 5.1 with the follow-up questions. Does anyone have any initial reactions to that or have questions for Deputy Chief Gonzalez or Chief Johnson? Yes, Vice Chair Root.
I have a really narrow question that I hope is real simple.
Okay.
First of all, thank you. I did not expect you to provide so much so fast. I really appreciate it a lot. One of the questions was about the information about stops, about officer-initiated stops. And I had heard you say on a number of occasions that the collection of data about the racial demographics of the person who was stopped started in February 2020. So I understood that. Do I understand now from what you gave us that February 2020 was also the time when any record keeping about stops started?
That's correct. That's
okay. That was new information to me. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
All right. I just got a random question, and it's in regards to just a number that I'm looking at here. And when you look at, I think it's page 3 or 4, where you have the breakdown of traffic stops from 2022 through December 2020. I see this big number of 433 for African-American people with traffic stops. And that really concerns me, because that number seems very, very gross to me. And I just wonder if you guys could put any context on that at all. Because, the whole, part of our mandate is really addressing certain issues that involve people of color. And this is just blaring out at me, and it's going to bother me. I don't want to wait to ask you about this question or about this information here. But is there any explanation to why this is? Because we're talking about 7.5% of the population. And I know it doesn't just really reflect that. This really reflects people coming in here for school, work, traffic stops, nonviolent things. And the disparity there, to me, seems very, very huge. And I just wanted to know if anyone could speak to that on staff, to that 433 number.
Well, I think, one of the things that we've talked about previously in some of these meetings is a desire and quite frankly, a need to have this data analyzed by, someone that knows what they're looking at and where these numbers really should fall for our community. So it's really, quite frankly, hard to give you context of, where does that number fall? Where is the benchmark essentially that we should be holding ourselves to? One of the things, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, it's an older document, but the PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, released a document titled The Benchmarking Challenge. And in that document, it's about 400 pages long, and it will put you to sleep, I guarantee you. One of the things that it talks about is the challenge of establishing a benchmark for a community, and it goes through the different methods and means by which those benchmarks are developed, and there's a bunch of different options for it. But the document also talks about the challenge of determining the right number and determining where that line is for police departments to adhere to. So again, kind of circling back, we really do need to pursue some sort of a study with people that are experts in this, not police officers, but people that are experts in this data, to be able to tell us where is our benchmark here in East Lansing? Because, quite frankly, we just don't know right now.
Chief Johnson, please go ahead.
No, and to answer your question, the deputy chief compiled those numbers, and he just compiled the numbers. And right now, we haven't a reason why those numbers are that way from your original question.
I can guess to why those numbers are that way. I mean, and I don't want to turn this into something that it shouldn't be, but I mean, Commissioner Haro, please go ahead.
So to get to, or to further Deputy Chief Gonzalez's point, in the field, from an academic standpoint, the issue of benchmarking is probably one of the most difficult that we encounter anytime we start to talk about the disparities, right? These disparities exist. We all know that they're there. The question is why. And then from a methodological standpoint, the question is, you know, are we talking about population? Are we talking about people coming in it, right? I mean, there are 9 million people that live in New York, 15 million people there any given day on the basis of tourism and people working there, right? So what's the benchmark there? You know, rough back of the envelope math, numbers of African Americans compared to total stops, we're looking at 1 out of every 4 stops in the city is of somebody who is Black. You know, in comparison to the city population itself, what does that look like? Obviously, that's high. In comparison to the city population and the student population, that's high. In comparison to people who might be passing through East Lansing, you know, from Lansing, from Detroit, from Ann Arbor, you know, wherever it is, that's a much more difficult number to pin down. When we're talking about how, not to devolve into a statistical argument, but when we're talking about how to get at that appropriate denominator, that number that represents the standard at which we're measuring against, really one of the things that we resort to is essentially, you know, for similarly situated cities as East Lansing, what does that number look like, right? And then from a methodological standpoint, are we using the same benchmark as they are, right? The problem isn't, to not be long-winded about this, the problem isn't what benchmark we use. The problem is in making sure that we clearly establish what the benchmark is and we know that how we got there, right? If we knew how many people drove through East Lansing that are not residents of East Lansing, this would be a relatively easy problem to solve, right? So this is effectively a data problem that to a certain extent, you know, we can account for somewhat statistically, but that we can't truly answer. And that makes social scientists like me unhappy. Because, you know, we don't like unanswered questions, but really the best that we can do is make our best guess and tell people this is the criteria that we use to make that guess, right? So what I'm trying to say is that going forward, one of the things that this means is that, you know, we have to establish how are we measuring things, and then what does that trend look like as we continue to measure things in the same way over time, right? All we need is to see that consistency in methodology. And then if those numbers go down, that's the trend that we're looking for. If those numbers get closer to, you know, what we've sort of decided we think is an acceptable number, right? When it comes to traffic stops, the most important piece of data is the hit rate, is how many of these stops resulted in some actionable police behavior, right? When we talk about terrorist stops on the street, the question is always, did we find guns or drugs, right? Because if we're making 100 stops and we find guns or drugs 5 times, then we have a serious problem, right? If we're making 100 stops and we find guns or drugs 95 times, as long as we can articulate that reasonable suspicion, right, then that's less of a problem. There might still be disparities there. There might still be bias in terms of how those stops are being made, right? But that's not a statistical problem. That's a moral problem in essence.
Thank you, Commissioner Raw. I appreciate that. And that's very helpful for me specifically. Anyone else have any comments before we move on? We're going to continue this conversation again, as I promised, in our next meeting. But please go ahead, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
So while I'm a marketing professional, I understand the importance of data and making decisions and using benchmarks. There's also a practical side to this and a risk assessment, reputation risk. And so sometimes there's this practical application. So how are things being done? So if I'm looking at this from a community standpoint, so not data driven, right? What's that perceived value? How is this being perceived by the community? So I'll use myself as a personal example. So we have 4 vehicles. And 3 of the 4 could be classified as stereotypical, like a black driver's driving them. Tinted windows, Vogue tires, our pickup truck with the visors and all of that. It's kind of low to the ground. When we're in those vehicles, we get stopped. When we're not in those vehicles, we don't get stopped. And so it's not science. I mean, science is the numbers. We have to look at science. We have to look at data for sure. But by and large, we have to also look at, I heard someone say the moral, like that's a moral issue. Like what's the stop rate? I heard Commissioner, Council Member Bacon talk about stops. And so it's more than just like if we get a hit, because there's something to be said about whether I get a ticket or not. If I'm just getting stopped because there's no other reason you can give me, there's no probable cause for you to stop me, but you stopped me because in my mind, it's the vehicle that I'm driving that made you decide you want to stop me. And you stop me. If my windows are too dark and they're not within that legal limit, then tell me that. But don't fabricate some other story that makes it 0 sense. And so those are the types of things that we're also talking about. So data, yes, absolutely important. But there is that practical application, like what is going on? What is the reputation risk to East Lansing? And East Lansing has an issue and has for years as far as that reputation. And people speak of East Lansing not in always a kind way when it comes to traffic stops. So it's more than just the hit; it is the stop itself. That psychological, what that does psychologically to a driver when a police gets behind them in East Lansing.
Oh, can I jump in quick? Oh, go ahead, Cedric.
Please, we want to just be mindful, but yes, City Manager Lahaniston, Commissioner Harrell.
Yeah, so I do think that knowing the data, knowing the benchmarks of who's driving in our streets is useful. But I mean, on the face of it, the number does concern me, and it does require a deeper look. I mean, it does require something that you're going to want to track, and we're going to want to see that we've made changes. So we made changes to this indiscriminate running of license plates. So this issue of just running up behind somebody and checking their license plate and then seeing if they have a warrant and pulling them over. Is that something that is leading to a disproportionate representation or over-representation of people who are Black or brown people? I don't know that answer, but let's look at that issue. Because as we make these changes and we train our officers, hopefully these numbers will change if we're doing things right. And if this license plate reading thing is something that was causing an over-representation of a minority group, then it's something that's good that we got rid of it. Let's see if that changes things over time, because if this is a full year, I'd like to see what happened, or this is 10 months. I'd like to see what happened by the data breaking out over months. When we've made change like the license plate reading, has that made any difference in this representation of it? Was that a tool that was, intentionally or unintentionally leading to discrimination? Was it a method of, where that was the outcome? So I think that we have to study it, look at it, see what we can do differently, see what we can do to improve. And then at some point, if numbers don't fit with where they should be, then you have to look back at individual officers and hold people accountable, right? If people are engaging in conduct that we don't like isn't true to our values? Are we monitoring that on a quarterly basis or even a monthly basis and saying, why are these stops occurring? And let's have a conversation about that and give me the reasons for that. And then it could lead to counseling, discipline, and those sorts of steps if there's a problem. But so I think there's a whole range of things we'd have to look at here, but data and deeper study and making the changes to improve, I think, are all a part of that and part of this process.
Thank you, City Manager. I'm going to let Councilmember Josephine go since we haven't heard very much from her. Go ahead, please.
I just want to ask, are we still in section 5.1 where we're asking for the follow-up questions on the data that they've given us, or have we moved into something further?
No, we're wrapping that up. We're just having that discussion, so we're still there. And we are going to wrap it up here. Please, Councilmember Bacon, and then Commissioner Raw.
Yeah, briefly, I think people have made good points on this. I think there needs to be maybe even the first task of the commission, when the newly formed commission, they need a benchmark for kind of what is or what did happen or what occurred. If the numbers don't bear out this reality and it's just a perception, then we can work from the fact that it's perception that needs to be improved and not the reality. But I think that's a huge part of problems. Anytime you're trying to make a cultural change, you have to acknowledge that there was an issue and that it is an issue, that it's clearly a perception issue. I mean, there's not a black person anywhere that it feels like riding through East Lansing without a good purpose. Like, so that's not a tricky question, but we kind of need to know, from a benchmark perspective, is that real or perception? Because if it's perception we need to be working on, that's a different task than working on reality. Like, so I think that's kind of maybe the first function that would need to roll into the commission. What are they working on to change perception around this? And it's really a non-existent issue, or it is an issue, and let's get to work on that. And then that way you can report back when you're going to talk to the community, this is what we've done and this is how these numbers look different. And now that this commission's been seated and that kind of thing. And ultimately that's why it's good to do business in East Lansing. That's why you're welcome here. That's why you should come to these other things, because ultimately that's what it's about. That it's a welcoming community and all those other things, and nobody's feeling put out by that. I think that's everybody's ultimate goal, so that's that.
Thank you. Finally, to Commissioner Rowe, and then we're going to move on and then continue this going further. Please go ahead, Commissioner Rowe.
I think Councilmember Bacon actually covered it. It needs to be that two-pronged approach. We need to get that data and then bring that to those community outreach meetings and find out, there's nothing worse than somebody feeling like I'm getting hassled by the police and I have no idea why, regardless of what the data tells us.
Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and move on to 5.2 and community input meeting discussion. I know that Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton wanted to chime in on this. I know Commissioner Root has, I'll let you speak for yourself, Vice Chair Root, in regards to your suggestions, or, and when I got that, it really helped me engage my thought process and who the stakeholders can be when it comes to this input. But I'll go ahead and hand off to you in regards to what you've submitted. You're muted.
What I submitted is in written communications. It is simply a list of people that I thought we could do outreach to, in addition to the publicity ideas that George mentioned at a previous meeting, which are the sort of standard outreach to the public at large, but that we could do some specific outreach as well. And I think we can get more people to come if all of us think about what kind of networks and organizations can we think of who care about this issue, who care about policing, who care about racism in East Lansing. Ask them to come so that we can benefit from their wisdom. So that list was meant, as a starting point and also as kind of a priming the pump. And I hope other people will think also about their ideas, because I'm sure there are more. I think given the time, Chuck and I talked about maybe at our next meeting, we should come close to finishing planning for this meeting. So maybe, given how late it is, maybe we could have a couple of people who would agree to talk before the next meeting to come with a proposal to talk about. next time about how to run it? Does that
You
sound
referring
like,
to, you're
What are you
referring
what are you
to,
referring to?
pardon me? A plan for how to design a community input meeting that we agreed that we wanted to hold in March when we have more recommendations to share with them.
we need some ideas, or some examples of, how we can do this in a way that's effective, and then it's compliant to our guidelines that we have to be under, and really conducting that. So we need help from you.
Okay, I'm happy to help on that,
Great.
but
All
that's not what I
right,
wanted to talk about in that.
You'll get your time.
Please
Is
go
there
ahead.
anybody besides Kelly who's interested in helping to plan a public input meeting for the study commission? I'll work with you.
I'll definitely chime in.
Okay. 3 is a good number.
Yeah, it
You
is.
can do a Zoom meeting.
Anyone else interested in having that discussion as well going forward? If not, we'll move on.
Okay,
To,
great, thanks.
Ellsworth Edgerton wants to get out.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so my comment or question or concern about the survey that we're going to be sending out. And so I know that there's been an RFP that's gone out. And the more I think about the target audience for that, with regards to registered voters, that is concerning to me, in that we may be missing out on who we really should be targeting. And so probably there could be a number of the people that are having contact with the police officers that may not even be registered voters. And we have, I heard someone talk about earlier, when we have game day and there's a big population of people that are coming into East Lansing that aren't residents of East Lansing, but have contact with the police. And so I'm thinking that, and it's not the, Commissioner Harrell, you and I are going to diverge on this one. It's not like for season ticket holders. Is probably the audience. I don't see them as that audience. But I just think that we need to, and I know the RFP have gone out. I know people are submitting proposals based upon that RFP, but I also work with, research companies and know that you can expand that scope once you start to have those conversations. But I really think that there needs to be more thought going into who that target audience should be, who's really coming in contact when we look at data. So we do have some data, right? When we're talking about data, and who should be included in that survey.
So I can just give you a quick thought on that. I mean, one thing we did was try to get a statistically valid survey that's representative of the community, East Lansing community. So that has benefits, but it has drawbacks. So obviously the benefit is you can infer from the whole community. If you survey 400 people, you can try to infer from the whole community of 50,000 what people's perceptions are for the city of East Lansing. We're trying to get at communication and our changes that we're making and seeing if people are understanding it. Do they appreciate it? Do they think we should go further? All of those things. So I think the questions are relevant to ask. The question you're looking at also is, should we be looking at something more and perhaps a different way of trying to survey special populations? And perhaps that's something we can make a recommendation to the future committee to say that you should do special outreach to groups that aren't necessarily, we have a survey now of the city of East Lansing residents, and we know what that looks like. But is there special surveys we should do, or additional surveying, perhaps of some surveyors standing on corners during game day, which is a great example, and saying we approached people between the age of 15 and 30, because that's males, people of color, whatever, because these are the people who tend to be more policed by our East Lansing Police Department, and then get a survey that tells people of their perceptions. Are you coming from the community, not from the community? And maybe trying to survey something like that at a future date, but looking at it more in depth. So that certainly is a relevant thing to look at. But is that what we would do at this point with this survey? I don't know if it can do both, because this is a pretty intensive and lengthy survey. It's not really amenable to a quick sort of a survey on the street, for instance, where someone walks up to someone and says, tell me about your perceptions, which is extremely relevant, but that might be something we'd want to recommend that the committee work on at a future date.
I'm thinking though that people that are not registered voters probably still could handle a lengthy survey.
Well, you mean
the survey that you're doing? I'm talking about the targeted audience.
Yeah, so you don't mean, so you mean expanding it to like non-residents at this point, or just going with trying to?
Well, I recall that the target audience was targeting registered voters.
I can exclude if they can just try to get a standard population for East Lansing residents, whether they're registered or not, and then just use that as a basis, because I just don't know what lists the researchers have. So that might be a good question to ask them. Can we do it without the, so still focusing on East Lansing residents, but just getting rid of the registered voter portion of that? I can check on that.
Thank you. That's all I had on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth, and that's a good one. And thank you, City Manager Lahanas, for being open to that discussion and possibility. It's important point she makes. All right, so I think we're gonna move on to item 5.3. Do you have any updates, Vice Chair Root, on regards to Section 2 by chance? You're muted.
We don't have any actual intention of discussing this tonight. It's there just because it's an unfinished item. It's unfinished because we're still collecting information, and we know that the version will keep being edited. So that's the only reason it's there, really. And a way of reminding people that I'm really, really happy to get input from people for the draft.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Vice Chair Root. We'll go ahead and move on. Does anyone have anything they want to say that has been said already tonight in our lengthy meeting this evening with commissioner announcements? Commissioner or Vice Chair Root?
I've got a question. I think we have a presentation scheduled at our next meeting, and I just wonder if we could confirm that. Do we have the labor lawyer coming?
That was going to be my question. Are we all set then to have our labor attorney come? She can talk about two separate topics, or maybe we can break them into two topics if you think they're too lengthy. One is Public Act 312 and the negotiating process of the contract. The other could be an employer view of the contract issues of discipline and discharge and investigations. So they're both labor issues, but they're two kind of separate issues, and they're both a little meaty. So it's up to the commission. If you've got some significant work to do that night, this might be too long to do both topics and then get to your work. Do you want to consider maybe trying to do a half? It's our labor attorney, so we can have her come 2 times, have her do negotiating the labor agreement, Public Act 312 on one time, and then maybe do discipline, discharge issues, and investigation issues. I'm just trying to figure out what would be useful to not overburden the group on one night.
Commissioner Boyle?
Well, I'm just wondering if we really need to have a presentation on 312 negotiation. I understand how it got included, but from the committee and commission standpoint, we can't renegotiate the contract. So really what we need to know is what the contracts provide, how the disciplinary process works, and what the constraints are regarding that, and anything about personnel files and that sort of thing. But understanding 312 arbitration and economic, non-economic issues and all that stuff, I don't really think we need to know that, and it's a lot to explain.
I'm great with that. So why don't we can start with the discipline, discharge, investigations, and contract stuff. And then if people want to know more about the other process, the concern was that if people say, the contract is a frustration, we want you to change it to this, or this part of investigation is something we want you to change it to that. It seems useful to understand the context of comparability and, how that works, because in that situation, saying is not the same as doing. So if the group says, we'd like to see this, it may not be possible to implement it, and understanding all the parameters is why I thought that was relevant. But I'm certainly good in paring it back to the internal investigation, discipline, discharge stuff from an employer view. And then we'll leave off the negotiation and 312 stuff unless questions come up.
Thank you, City Manager Hahn. So we'll roll with that for sure. And we will defer to Commissioner Boyle's expertise and what we should be focusing on that. So I think we're going to be good with that. If that's okay with you, we can confirm that then?
Yep, we will confirm it for the 8th, right? March 8th, I believe, right?
Correct. That's correct. All right, moving on to.
February.
Sorry, February 8th. You're right. That's what I meant.
Okay. For the record, for Diane there, February 8th. All right, so we're down to adjournment. Before we get to that, I just want to say thank you for the extra time tonight. We needed to have this kind of conversation. I'm sorry I went long-winded. I promise that we won't have these very often, but every once in a while we get to these points and we get to a point where we need to drag it out a little bit. So hopefully you guys appreciate what we got done tonight. We do have some great foundational pieces and some other things that are moving parts right now. So I just want to say thank you for your extra time tonight. And I will look for a motion for adjournment. You want to stay?
So moved.
All right, moved by Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us and have a good night. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
All right, seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you so
Night
much.
all.
Thank you, staff.